And with that, let's get into it. Starting with this first slide, which is where a lot of people are at. They're tired of watering their lawns. They don't want to put all of the resources into it that they know that they would need to have a beautiful lawn. Lawns are kind of boring to begin with, but where do we go from here? What do we do? This is really what this class is all about. And for those of you that have gardens as well, even people who have worked with plants for a long time, hopefully we'll introduce some new ideas about how to look at and how to conceptualize your space to really help you get everything you want to out of the outdoor spaces that you have influence over. And that is part of what we do at the Waterwise Community Center. For those of you who are new to us formally, we are the Chino Basin Water Conservation District. To the public, we call ourselves the Waterwise Community Center. And we are a special district. So we're actually a local government agency with an elected board with a service area serving the western edge of San Bernardino County. And essentially, we formed in 1949 by a public vote to protect the Chino groundwater basin, which is a huge resource for our communities, provides about 60% of the water used locally. And as the area urbanized and moved from agriculture to the city, what we do to pursue that has expanded. And today we say that our mission is threefold. We demonstrate, we educate, and we percolate. So on the demonstration side, we have a roughly 2-acre demonstration garden specifically aimed at ideas for home landscapes. It's closed to the public right now, but we are rapidly working on reopening, and hopefully in the next few weeks, we'll be open to the public again. In terms of education, we have all sorts of no-cost programs, things like this, in-person workshops a lot of the time, although those are temporarily on hold, and a whole host of K through 12 curriculum integrated education as well. And then percolation. We own a number of large-scale properties, many of which are actually old gravel pits that have been rearranged to capture and clean stormwater and help recharge our local groundwater basin. We work with all sorts of different audiences. And the best way to stay in touch with what we are up to is to sign up for a monthly newsletter, which you can do at cbwcd.org/newsletter. And no junk, just great content and information about the programs we have coming up. And that was my note in case I forgot to do the opening poll to make sure I do that. So we already covered that, so let's get going. Wanted to spend just a moment about who I am and why I'm even talking to you about this for those of you who have not been with workshops with me before. My name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager at Chino Basin Water Conservation District. And I'm also a big gardening and landscaping nerd. I've been working with gardens and landscapes at commercial and residential scale obsessively for essentially the last 15 years. And in that process, I got a master's degree in landscape architecture at Cal Poly Pomona and worked on a variety of projects before I came to the Waterwise Community Center in Chino Basin Water Conservation District. I worked at the Huntington Library and Botanical Gardens for 8 years and was the landscape design and planning coordinator there. So I've worked on public scale projects as well as private projects, but a lot of my motivation in moving into that world in the first place was really just starting with the plain old Los Angeles area suburbs. I was born and raised in Van Nuys, California, kind of generic LA suburb, looks very much like a lot of the 1950s built neighborhoods of Ontario, for those of you who are closer out to our service area. And there are definitely worse places to grow up, but never really liked it and was kind of curious about why we built these kind of cookie cutter houses and neighborhoods and landscapes that were kind of boring. And through a kind of long roundabout way, that got me into being very interested in what we can do with the largely suburban landscape, which is actually a lot of space, and really got fascinated with the idea that we can really use a lot less resources and get a lot more out of our landscapes. And so that has been the last 15 years of my life, which has led me to presenting workshops like this for groups like you. And so getting back to this basic premise, We're looking for more, and we can get a lot more. But where do we start? So for those of you who have been to any of the other workshops I've taught that deal anything with design, you've seen this slide before. Where do we start? We don't start here. We don't start at the nursery just purchasing plants, because that gets us a random assortment of plants, but doesn't really get us what we are going to need for success. It doesn't get us to the point where we're getting everything we want out of our landscapes, where we're getting a lot more, where maintenance is under control, where our plants are well selected, well chosen for our site, and are going to be set up to be happy and healthy and beautiful long term. So where we start is our goals. So for those of you who have been to our landscape transformation basics class, there's going to be a bit of overlap, but mostly new content in this workshop. Just wanted to set that out there. That landscape transformation basics workshop, which we teach once a month, is a little teaser from a lot of our different workshops, but doesn't really go deep into the subject matter. So this is where we're going to go deep into design. So you start with your goals, and this is a list of goals from what I tell people are the most difficult residential clients I ever worked with. The reason why is because they were my parents, and they were never really that interested in landscaping until the turf removal rebates hit. And my father loves a good deal and just thought it, was probably a good idea. But at $3.75 a square foot to remove turf in the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power area, it was time to do something about it. So I was used to working with clients who were interested in my thoughts and ideas and respected my experience. And then I was working for my parents. My dad's goals were easy, whatever made my mom happy. My mom had a lot of goals for that small yard that you just saw a picture of. She wanted a comfortable place to sit and read, a place that feels relaxing, the sound of water, something that was relatively simple to maintain, something that would hide an ugly cinder block wall without spending a lot of money, something that would attract birds, something that would look nice, something that would grow some vegetables, and cram all of that into a small space while making that small space feel bigger. And that's very doable using basic principles of design, the sort of things that we're going to talk about in this workshop. But it doesn't happen randomly by hitting the nursery and loading up the cart with plants. It needs to go through a process to weigh all of those goals, analyze the site, figure out the best places to locate the physical things that are going to provide all of these functions, and then bring it all home with choosing a beautiful set of plants to help enhance all of that. So that's really what we're going to talk about. And we have plenty of resources to help you with the plant selection. Stay tuned on that. For those of you who are new to this, you might be surprised at how little we're going to talk about the actual plants themselves in this workshop. We will talk about them, we will cover them, but there's so much to talk about with design that we're not going to go plant by plant saying, this is a cool plant, here's why you should plant this one. We have that workshop. We taught it last week. It was called Favorite Plants for Inland Empire Gardens. And that's posted on YouTube right now. So if you didn't join us for that one, I encourage you after this, not necessarily today, because that'd be a lot of content to take in, but sometime soon, take a look at that one, whether or not you live in the inland area. All of those plants are great in other areas, and use this and that and our other resources together to come up with a great design for your space. So we started with this after we had done lots of work to take out the lawn. For those of you who have a lawn to take out, look forward into our workshop schedule, and we're going to be doing a 3-hour Saturday workshop just about turf removal techniques, because it's a little more complicated to really do it right than a lot of people assume at the beginning. You can't just reliably turn the water off and hope for the best. And so this is layout day, April 2015. We had our sketched out design, but it's a pretty small space. Didn't really, even on this project, really have every plant is measured out to the foot. We knew what we wanted. We knew exactly where the accent plants were going to go. We knew roughly how many filler plants we needed, and it was going to be a kind of informal layout. So if that appeals to you more, and the thought of doing all the detailed measurements and graph paper and all that sort of stuff, it just seems really intimidated. You don't necessarily need to do that. For those of you who are willing to take it on, it's a great idea. But if your process is to be less formal, that's okay too. And just using really simple tools in the layout, we knew that we were going to want that sound of water was going to be a water feature in the middle right here. We knew that we wanted some plants around that water feature. And then we knew we wanted a path around that. And so hit a wood stake in the middle, had this strapping material in the garage, just kind of like a woven strap, tied a circle around it, pulled it tight, measured out, and then just used a bag of flour as I was walking around holding that strap tight from that tie in the center to get my perfect circle. Then walked, I think it was about 4 feet out, drew another one. That was going to be our major path. We knew we were going to want a bench back here, so that was the area for that. And we made the path a little bit wider than we otherwise would need for walking space because we knew we wanted it to be a full kind of grown in look. So the plants were going to eat away at the path some. So keeping it relatively simple, demystifying what could be a complicated process is really a lot of what this talk is going to be about. It can be very intuitive, very simple, as long as it's not a random process, unless that's specifically what you want. And so here you can see we are getting starting on the planting. And just like we were talking about, laid it out on the site using flour. If you have a long kind of curving or winding path, a great trick is to leave a garden hose in the sun for a little while and then use that to define your path edge. And you can take a look at it and then move it or nudge it. And when you finally have that garden hose laid out exactly how you like it, then you can use either stakes or little flags or flour, depending on how long you need to be there, or a can of paint, and kind of set it after that. And if you don't like things now during that installation, that's the time to change it up. You can do it later, but during the design phase, during this immediate layout phase, that is where it's easy. Anything after that, it's renovation, it's digging things up, it's reinvesting in money and materials potentially. So don't get set, even if you have a plan on paper. Remember, as you lay it out, it's always time to notice things and make some little changes. I've seen that happen with even really, really well-respected designers and landscape architects. They're always looking as you go into the site layout. That's an integral part of the design process. And so this is right after planting, April 2015. This is going to mostly look like a few little plants in a sea of mulch, whether it's wood chips or gravel or whatever you have. And you might think this is never going to grow in. Don't worry, don't grab a bunch more plants and cram them in there because it's going to get going. So this is April 2015. Our water feature is not quite in yet, but we had dug a little pre-made plastic vault to have the water feature on top that was going to have stones around it. And then that came later. And this is October of that same year, showing a very simple palette of kind of Mediterranean semi-dry meadow. This is a landscape that got water once a week the first year and a half-ish, and then gets water twice a month. Good deep soak now. He uses way less water than the lawn that was there before. That never looked good in the first place anyways. And you can see here's the design goals being met. The sound of water to reduce the noise of the other yards that still need lawnmowers and weed whackers to take care of them. This doesn't need any of that anymore. The quiet place to sit and read. See the one vegetable bed that has some space to grow just a few veggies. Have some pops of color from bearded irises. And wildlife starting to show up. Just add water is one of the main wildlife things. So this is a cell phone picture of a falcon that just decided to come by for a drink. Really changed the space. And in this case, yeah, keeping it simple with a simple metal palette and pops of color. And so if you compare this to what would have happened if we just hit the nursery and started buying things, what would have happened is we would have bought way, way fewer of this main grass species that we use. It's actually a grass-like plant, a sedge. We would have probably gotten way more color, and that would have been charming in one way, but it would have been much more of a mishmash. And with that mishmash, it would have probably made the small space feel smaller instead of having a more coherent plant palette where the accents really pop. And then the rest of the time, it's just this nice, quiet space that was part of the design. And it's continued to grow in nicely. So April 2019, more recent picture. And the color comes and goes throughout the year, but it's a very comfortable space year round. It's my nephew enjoying the space. And so the question, and what I want you to be thinking about through this workshop is, what's your vision of a perfect garden or a landscape for you? So what I showed you was just one example. I'll show you many more. That was not the perfect garden or landscape for me. I prefer a bit of a different style. But whatever your style is, whatever it is that you can envision for yourself, you can make a plan to create something like that. So a lot of this is thinking about, what are your goals? What's going to feel right to you? Do you like a more formal look or a more natural look? Do you like it to be very modern and rectilinear looking, or do you like it to be much more relaxed? Coming up with those ideas, getting that inspiration, and then pursuing that, that's going to be part of your pathway to success. So what is design? Design is a tool to help you get to that vision. You don't need to be creative, but you can be. If you're much more of a linear kind of, quote, left brain person, and you feel you don't have a creative bone in your body, you can still use the principles of design to create something great. If you are someone who is a born creative, that's great. You can bring all of that to this process. You don't need to be able to draw well. I can't draw well. That's never been a problem for me being a designer, because I understand the principles, I understand the materials that I'm working with, and the drawing is just a basic representation. Your drawings, if you're doing part of this as sketching things out as the process, which I highly recommend, they could look like a 5-year-old did them. Doesn't make them any worse. They can still be just as useful. And you don't need to know a ton. You need to learn a bit, and you need to think things through. And this workshop is largely a system to help you do that. I really like this quote from Henry David Thoreau. What's the use of a house if you haven't got a tolerable planet to put it on? And that is not to talk smack about whoever put in this landscape in front of their house, because chances are they thought they were doing the right thing. They were taking out their lawn, they were putting in something that's going to require a lot less water and resources. But the problem with these gravel scapes with a few plants here or there, especially in Southern California, is that other than using less water, they're not any better than what they're replacing. And in fact, at least lawns function as evaporative coolers, even though they're using water. But all this gravel in full sun just soaks in the heat all day long. And to the point where when someone comes home in the evening to a landscape like this, that area is going to stay hotter. The front of the house is going to feel hotter for hours and hours after the sun goes down. So we don't need to resort to this. Southern California is not truly a desert. We're a Mediterranean climate, and we can embrace that look and that feeling and have great landscapes that only need water about once a month in our landscapes if we want to go that far. And there's plenty of great options to do that. Landscapes take up a lot of space in Southern California. And for a long time, the question's been, does my landscape fit in, or only what does it look like? And what it looks like is very important. But really, I want to challenge you to think more critically and to demand more out of your landscapes. Landscapes are expensive. If you have a single family house in Southern California, you're paying a premium for that. And I want you to challenge yourself to not only have a beautiful landscape, but has a landscape that does a lot as well. Does a lot for you as a place to recreate in or spend quality time with your family and friends in outdoors, and can also at the same time do a lot to provide valuable needed habitat for songbirds and pollinators and butterflies, which lawns just simply don't provide. And you can have all of that for sure We're going to talk a little bit about the wildlife aspect, but we're also going to be doing another Saturday morning class sometime soon. I think I have the date at the end of the presentation, which is going to be all about gardening for birds, pollinators, butterflies, and wildlife habitat. And so we're going to expand a lot more on that. And I'd encourage you to either join us for that or check out the posted online workshop afterwards. But where do we start? You should know this answer by now. Again, not here. Just very briefly, this is going to overlap just a little bit with our native design class, but not much. We're just going to spend a moment on it. But it's an important place to think about as we look at our yards. So for inspiration, maybe we start in the wilds that surround our urban Southern California. And I don't want you to take it the wrong way. I don't want my yard to look exactly like this, but our oak woodlands and our chaparral areas are dense with plants. Notice that these are not seas of gravel with a couple of hot and dry succulents in between. As we look at all of these, important things to note are the plant density and what's on the ground. And so sometimes I'll go a little farther afield from where we actually live, because some of our great landscape types that historically would have been our valley areas are just not here anymore because we built cities over the whole things. And yes, these landscapes, especially the grasslands, go dormant in the summer. It does get hot and dry, but we can choose our plant palette for our yards to be more evergreen with a once a month deep soak into irrigation. We can prevent things from getting really dry. But most of our wild areas are wall-to-wall vegetation. And if you get to them in the pleasant times of the year, which are the kind of things that we would try to emulate year-round in our gardens, they are gorgeous, comfortable places to be. Coming up are a few pictures from the Santa Rosa Plateau. It's one of my very favorite places to visit for inspiration. And this is kind of an oak savanna ecosystem with some grasslands mixed in. And so, yes, there's some cactuses, but there's also wildflowers, grasses, all sorts of blooming perennial plants and shrubs. We're getting a bit of a delay on the load speed. So some of these I'm going through a little bit slow for that reason. Just gorgeous, comfortable places to be. And when you zoom in on the details, filled with color. So new growth on an oak tree, monkey flowers, California poppies, very easy to grow at home. Perennial bush lupins, beautiful, smell great. Native currants, and even some rarer bulbs like chocolate lilies. And so you might not want a naturalistic look for your yard, but if you do, looking at the patterns in places like this of trees and shrubs and how the rocks come together are great. But even if you want things formal, it's very important to note how much plant material we can get perfectly adapted to Southern California. And we don't have to have a few plants in a sea of gravel or a sea of wood chips. So why does this all work well? Why do we look at things like that and see beauty and not chaos? Well, one important concept is the concept of a niche, which technically you can look at that definition. It's interactions of species with all the members of a community. There's living and non-living factors, but we don't need to get that technical. Essentially, we can see that things are layered. So when there's a tree, there's usually plants underneath it. There's, even in those grasses, it's not just all grass, there's other kinds of plants. There's things that to us provide visual interest, but those are all things that are growing together, interacting both physically in terms of their structure of those plants, but also underneath the soil where there's a whole network of beneficial interactions going on. Those landscapes form a system where if there's a niche that's open, it's going to get filled by something if there's a vacancy. So in our yards, if we're trying to maintain large areas between our plants that are just wood chips or mulch, that's going to get filled by something, and it's probably going to be the weeds blowing in from next door. So planting these beautiful, lush spaces is also a way of keeping our maintenance lower while keeping a nice look. And so part of what we're going to try to do is whatever our aesthetic is, we're going to try to assemble something where we have all of these niches filled, our own little custom for our project plant community, where we have trees and shrubs and ground covers all interacting, all carefully chosen, that want the same amount of sun for the area, the same amount of irrigation, moisture levels, assembling our own plant communities. And so this can be done in a quite literal way. So this is a landscape that I designed as a picnic area, just really based on the edge of a Southern California oak woodland, mimicking a plant community for a very natural look. This next image is a little bit more mixed of a plant community, but very deliberately inspired by native chaparral. So if that's an approach that you want to take, you can definitely say, I like this space, maybe I'll change a few plants, but that's the look I'm going to go for and get inspiration from that. And if you're interested in kind of more of that approach, definitely check out the recording of our native design class. But you can also, and most of us will, really assemble our own plant communities, but using some of those principles of what holds a landscape together that we'll talk about. So let's take a step back and talk a little bit more about what design is. Design is absolutely not a purple flowering plant over here next to a yellow flowering plant over there. If you want to think about colors, you can definitely do that, but it's much wider and much more useful. And to me, color in terms of flowers is like the icing on the cake. I think more about the other properties of the plants, their needs, their general form. And really, if I think about color, it's mostly about the leaf color, the texture, the shape of the plants, how those are going to look next to each other. I let the colors work themselves out, and they usually do that beautifully. Sometimes I'll think a little bit about color, but yeah, it's really not a major part of design. And you'll read about the philosophies if you really get into it of different professional designers, and some worry about it and some don't. It's not an absolute thing to get obsessed over. Design doesn't require starting over or having a blank slate. You don't need to hire someone with a bulldozer to clear your whole backyard. It can be used just as well for incremental improvements or solving problems in your garden. So we're going to look at this backyard as a case study. This is a place that I used to rent in Altadena, where we didn't tear out all the trees or start over, just kind of worked around what we had already. Design is a system. Like I said before, you don't need to be creative. You don't need to be a genius. Design is about setting your goals, making a plan, and then taking the steps to accomplish your goals. Pretty simple. So we're going to look at some slides that are quite a bit of text, but these are really the important principles that I want you to understand, so that when we get back into looking at examples from gardens and all the pretty pictures, these are going to be the things, the lenses for you to look at those examples through to really get the most out of the experience of seeing that part of the presentation. So some notes. Gardens are not furniture. This is not interior design, meaning with interior design, you carefully choose your couch and your carpet and the cabinet. And as long as your cats don't scratch it up, that's all just going to stay there. And the goal would be that it stays in the condition where you install it. Gardens are living systems, and they're going to grow and they're going to change. And over time, some things are going to die and parts that are sunny are going to become shady. And that's great. That's the fun of it. That's, to me, why it's more interesting than interior design. Design in terms of a landscape is a way to achieve a functionable, maintainable, living system that's a pleasure to be in. It's a pleasure to interact with. And compared to more conventional maintenance, like if you're someone who mows your own lawn and does your own edging and things like that, it's also a pleasure to maintain. When I come in from doing pruning in my backyard, I smell amazing from all the great smelling California plants. I've spent time with birds and butterflies and not walking behind a piece of equipment that's spewing out gas fumes at me. Yes, you are the designer, but you're never fully in control. It's really more of a negotiation between you, the plants, the wild world. And design is best as a continual process because things are going to change. You're going to notice new things. Inevitably, even if most of your landscape is doing well, something will die. And that'll be an opportunity to maybe put in something that's even more interesting than the last thing that you had, or have a different idea. So if you go into the design and then the actual creating the garden process with a sense of curiosity, a willingness to learn, and an understanding that no landscape is perfect, all landscapes evolve over time and they all have disturbances, it's going to be a lot more fun. It's going to be a lot more interesting. And it's going to be a much more rewarding experience. Even the gardens that you see photographed in glossy landscape design magazines or online and kind of any of those sources, those all have a few dying plants in them. And if they're California gardens or in a climate like ours, they're all going to look kind of tired come August. But the thing is that when the professional photographer goes out there, they take the pictures of the peak of spring almost all the time. And if there's dead plants, they just don't put them in the frame of the camera. So don't assume that you're going to have a perfect looking garden year round, all the time, and will never have any issues, because that will make you stressed out and that will make the whole thing not fun. You will have a beautiful garden if you follow the basic principles of the things that we teach in our workshops. And if you're a little bit more relaxed about it, the whole thing is much more interesting, much more pleasurable. So we're talking about design, but who are we designing for exactly? So I propose that we're designing for people and planet. And I take a kind of wide view of people. So who exactly? Kid people, elderly people, dog people, wild bird people, living things. But who it is going to make some pretty important decisions. If your landscape needs to be kid friendly, if you have a 80-pound dog that's going to crash through the landscape, that's going to change your decisions. If grandpa's coming over in a wheelchair and you want to spend time outside with him, that's going to have an impact on your decisions about spaces, materials, path widths, the kinds of plants you put in for dogs or kids. And so take that all into account. And then for people, our spaces should be comfortable, functional, beautiful, maintainable, safe for sure, durable, affordable for our budgets. If you have a small budget, that's just fine. Just make sure that your design takes that into account. And strive for sustainable use of resources. And edible, I always like to throw in some edible plants as well. So this is part of my design committee. We have Fuyu, my cat, supervising. This is from where I'm sitting right now, supervising our growing in landscape at the desk in my house. And we have another couple of our kittens keeping track and tallies of the wildlife that come to the young front yard at the house I live now. And so these are literally some of the people I think about as I look at design. Where do I place a bird bath? Where do I place different elements of the design? The view of the cats in my house out because I have indoor cats, because I don't want them to eat all the birds that we bring to our garden, is part of the design process for me. And so we said people and planet. So some basic principles for the planet side of it. Our gardens should net have an ecological benefit. I am a huge proponent that that's not a sacrifice. We can have everything we want out of our landscapes and more, and still have them benefit the environment. They can hold and infiltrate water, help recharge the groundwater table. If they can't capture the water, water should be cleaner by the time it's leaving your garden out into the street than when it hit your roof. That's not hard to do. If it's not edible, might as well have a low demand for irrigation water, because there's hundreds to thousands of low water plants that we can plant that are as, if not more interesting and beautiful than higher water plants that have traditionally been used in Southern California. We can provide year-round habitat for birds, beneficial insects, and lizards with plants and other features. And these educational spaces can connect all of us to the wider world. So I think this is important for every age, but especially if you have kids or grandkids, spending time, a garden that does these things can really impact their understanding of the natural world, their value of the natural world as they grow up. Could be a huge benefit. So by now, hopefully you understand that planting design, choosing and spacing the plants, is just one part of design. But it is an important part of design. And so for putting plants together, here are some of the key ideas. And the big concept is put the right plant in the right place. And there's much more content about this on the workshop that we taught recently, the Top Plants for Inland Empire Landscapes workshop. But these basics are important to cover, so I cover them in a lot of workshops. The main difference from my experience of talking with different home gardeners between people with a green thumb and people who say they have a brown thumb or a black thumb is that people who don't have success with gardens buy something, stick it in the ground, and hope for the best. People who do have success do a minimum amount of research, understanding their plants and trying to make sure that plants that want full sun get full sun, plants that want part shade get part shade in the yard, and that they're only going to buy plants that fit the space that they need a plant for. They are going to group plants with similar water needs. So plants that need water once a week are going to go together where they get hit by the same part of the irrigation system at the same time. The plants that want water once a month, those are also going to be grouped together. Same thing. There's some plants here or there. Those are some that are great for transitions that are really flexible on that and can be grouped with either one. But a lot of plants really fall into the like once a week, twice a month, once a month kind of categories. And when we look at the resources for plants, well, some of those have some of that. Look up the mature size of each plant. The plant, in most cases, is going to get that big, and sometimes it's going to get that big in a year or two. So don't cram in a bunch of plants. I definitely, just as often as I see way too much space between plants, I see way little too space in between plants. A lot of landscapes kind of congregate there. Spend that extra time trying to think and weigh things out to make sure that spacing is correct. That's going to be easier to do if you're the kind of person to take all your measurements and draw it out on graph paper. But if you're not, still maintain that as a priority. So in parts of the yard of the place that I live now, we did the whole drawing everything to scale thing. We did that for the front yard. For the backyard, we're building more of a plant collection because my partner and I are both plant nerds. And every once in a while, we'll end up with one extra plant that we just don't have a good space for. Don't cram it in between 3 other plants because then all 4 of those plants are going to struggle. Worst case scenario, you have a beautiful plant to give to a friend as a gift, but don't just cram a bunch of stuff in there. But think about layering. So layering is important because at the same time, I've also seen people, and I've even seen professional plans drawn by landscape architects where the 25-foot canopy shade tree is drawn on a plan to be 25 feet wide, even though it's going into the ground as a 8-inch wide 5-gallon pot. And it's going to be a decade before it's that wide. So think about that kind of succession, that time element. And in a decade, maybe that's going to be a part shade area that needs shade plants underneath. But for the next decade, maybe that's going to continue to be full sun. So you're going to have some full sun ground covers and you're going to have that layering effect. So it's not just wide open, kind of funny looking space. And then as you go, observe and learn both from what works and also just as, if not more importantly, what doesn't work. I tell people that a lot of what I learned about plants is because of the fact that I have killed more plants than most people that I know. But I try to learn from it. And once you do that for quite a number of years, you start to learn a bunch of lessons. And then many drought tolerant plants don't want a lot of the traditional horticulture care. It's infrequent deep watering after things are established. Most plants, even if they're water-wise, are going to want a good soak once a week the first year in the ground, planted in the fall or winter. Most of our water-wise plants don't need any fertilizer. And unless it's crazy heavy clay soil, don't need compost either. It's really about assembling the right plant in the right patterns in harmony with the right surrounding features. And so those major factors are going to be sun or shade, soil drainage, meaning most Waterwise plants, native plants, not all, but most, want well-drained soil. And if not, you're going to plant plants adapted to clay soil or poorly draining soil. And if that's the case for you, it's not the end of the world. There's plenty of plants that are fine in clay soil. And in fact, it might even make choosing your plants a little bit easier. In our more horticultural based classes, we really go into how to do a drainage test. So I'm not going to cover that here, but we do have a resource. So at that cbwcd.org/presentations website, you can download, there's a link to a PDF towards the top there that is a guide to California native garden design. It's a kind of little printed publication that we also make available digitally that we created. And there is a section, even if you're not interested in native plants, that goes over how to do a drainage test and what that means, how to calculate your inches per hour of drainage and know if you have well-drained soil or not. We talked about irrigation frequency. Growth habit or shape is also important. Is the plant, if it's a shrub, does it have a really upright growth pattern, or is it sprawly? Those sorts of things are going to affect how it's going to interact with the plants around it. And then if you can find the information, growth rate. And the idea with growth rate is that there's some great plants that are relatively slow growing in their first couple of years. Sometimes then they catch up. So like the native manzanitas are one of them. They usually don't put on that much growth their first year. So you might need to leave a little extra space around them if you're planting it, for example, next to a native sage. Those things get going, and sometimes in a year could be 6 feet wide. So if you crowd the slow grower a little too close to the fast grower, that fast grower is going to dominate. So just kind of really growth rate is about making sure you give enough space, or you keep an eye on your slow growing plants as they grow in, making sure that they don't get crowded out. Gardens don't need to have a huge number of different plants unless that's part of your goal. But most people who I talk to who come to our workshops, their goal isn't to become a big old plant nerd. Most of them just want to have a nice landscape that's easier to maintain and takes less resources than the lawn they're replacing. That's going to be beautiful and, great if it brings in some birds, helps provide good homes for them. So the key for most of you is going to be each space that you have that needs plants, fill it with one or a few different plants, and really concentrate more on how to assemble those well-chosen plants rather than a complex planting design of 82 different things. Are those plants going to be layered like we talked about, tree, shrub, ground cover? Are they going to be grouped? A group of 3 of this one next to 5 of that one, and then 3 of the first one again? That's a very effective way of approaching planting design. Or is it going to be more random? Random could be a bunch of different plants if you're actually trying to build a plant collection, or it can be something like the meadow I showed in the backyard at the beginning, where there's one dominant grass species and then little random accents here and there. Those accents are often pops of color, or they're pops of a form that is very different than the form of the other plants that surround it. And then little elements of repetition maybe. So maybe you have one each of different shrubs, but then your ground cover layer repeats over and over again to make it more coherent. Or sometimes just having things as a big swath, really choosing maybe like native deer grass that is, as long as it gets a little water, kind of a sure thing, very beautiful, and planting a whole big swath of it in a yard. Sometimes for a medium-sized backyard, you can really achieve a professional design look by working with big swaths of relatively few numbers of well-chosen plants. And if those plants are still plants that provide good habitat, that's still, and sometimes it's even more beneficial to wildlife. And then it might be a combination of those things. So as we're going to start, we're going to be getting to all the pretty pictures quite soon, I promise. But as we go into that, now you're going to be able to look at a picture and think, okay, how is that planting kind of put together? What's going on with the layering of the plantings? What's going on with the materials in that landscape? And then one of the last things that we'll talk about is those basic visual aspects of planting design. So the last slide, we talked about some of those more grouping kind of things. Other things to talk about are color. We briefly talked about it, but leaf color, definitely more important than flower color, especially when you're looking at contrast. So we have so many great grayish or bluish or light green California or Mediterranean climate plants, and then some dark ones. That kind of contrast and that effect in the garden, that is every day of the year. And color for some plants is just for a few weeks in terms of the flower color. Texture, broadleaf plants next to grasses, next to like a ferny leaf kind of plant. That's also something that happens all the time. And then we talked a little bit about grouping plants. Just one real quick planting design tip might as well mention. For me, it's not a rule, but in general, when you're looking at grouping, just for some reason, how the eye lands, odd numbers of plants in a group, so 5 of something, 3 of something, 7 of something, 9 of something, tends to look a little more natural and a little bit easy to balance than the even numbers. Now, if there's a space where 4 is just the number that works, I will go with that. But just as a default, getting started in design, that's one tip that might help you out. Repetition, we talked about. Accent or surprise, that's just one. Oftentimes, this does rely on seasonal flower color. Maybe you have a curving path in your backyard and you round a corner and you know that every spring for a month, there's going to be one plant that just captures your eye, drop dead gorgeous color. Those effects with an otherwise simple landscape are really powerful as well. And so there's the YouTube link as well to a couple of other workshops that we have that can provide much more information about that plant specific aspect. And so here's just one example from my front yard showing some contrast in texture and in color. This is fragrant pitcher sage on the left, which has a broad fuzzy leaf and an incredible smell. And these just opening in this picture, kind of pinkish bell-shaped flowers next to native yarrow, which is a ground cover, which has a very ferny leaf. It's much darker. The light captures differently. The form is different. And so that's a contrast other than the flowers that's going to happen every day. And you can see in the back, kind of fuzzy in the background, there's some, again, very contrasting native deer grass, that very upright, very linear. Those are the sorts of things that you can think about if you want to get into those visual aspects. Another example, this is just a front yard that I looked at, and I was driving by in Pasadena at one point, pulled over and took some pictures. This is a zoom in. To me, this is like just as beautiful as a lot of botanical gardens that I've seen. It's a mostly desert landscape, has decomposed granite and organic mulch, but this is so different than the couple of cactus in a sea of mulch kind of look. It has California native sage, it has a California native desert mallow, it has some other Mediterranean climate shrubs for some contrast in the background. And to me, rather than a garden that's just like gravel or decomposed granite and cactus, the contrast between the shrubs, the little bit of seasonal color from the flowers, and the cactus really makes both the whole landscape look great, much more comfortable, but it also accents the sculptural forms of the cactus much more than just a cactus garden. If you go out into the beautiful spots of the California desert that attract tourists from all over the world, it's not just a bunch of cactus. There's all of these flowering shrubs as well. There's seasonal wildflowers. And so this is a relatively small, once you zoom out, front yard. But by integrating succulents, California native plants like the white sage, like this, possibly an Allen Chickering sage, there's 3, all of these are very closely related. Those also smell great and bring that other great aspect to that desert-ish look. California buckwheat. So here's the experience kind of walking down the street. So, you know, not very formal. Some people might think it needs a little bit more pruning on the right-hand side, but simple, much more interesting than everything else that is around it in the neighborhood, and just a really lovely landscape. Also looking at contrast. Next slide, this is a planting design that I did at the Huntington Library. So this is a mixed Mediterranean grassland with species. The main grass species is a dwarf cousin of our native deer grass that comes from Texas. Want to keep it a little smaller, mixed in with South African aloes and some other larger trees and shrubs. But this really relies on, again, that contrast of the grasses and the aloes. And there's a few red hot pokers, another South African plant, perennial that kind of just blends into the grasses and sends up those flowers on the left-hand side. So planting design is a study in contrast. And sometimes, again, to be really simple. So that's that same landscape, different area where there was one pre-existing tree. And underneath that, we didn't need a lot of complexity. Just as a backdrop for this shady bench area, that's just a meadow of native deer grass. Didn't really need the color accents there. And so a lot of the other residential pictures that I'm going to show in this workshop are from the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. And I would really encourage all of you to check that out, either in person. It's done once a year on a weekend in the spring. This year it had to go online and be virtual, but as people who may have missed it, they put a bunch of extra content online, which is still there. So you can go to nativeplantgardentour.org. And if you're looking for inspiration for residential garden design and you're interested at all in California natives, but even if you're not, just to see things like shade structures and pathways and how different things get built, totally worth checking out. And so you can go to the main website, and that's always the pictures and the gardens that were featured this last year, but they archive it. So at the bottom of it, you can go back years and look at pictures of every single garden that's been on there, all sorts of great stuff. So a lot of these are either pictures that I've used with permission from that website or that I've taken myself on that tour. Definitely worth checking out. They always have one day that's kind of valley areas, a lot of San Fernando and San Gabriel Valley. For those of you who are local to us at the Waterwise Community Center in our service area, San Bernardino County, that day in the valleys, that's very similar soils, very similar climate, hot in the summer to what we experience out here, very applicable. And then they have another day that's more LA proper, which has a lot of great, often smaller landscapes and kind of that more coastal influence. So we talked about how, it can be any look. So I was like showing a few pictures from this property, which is mostly California native, but very formal, kind of traditional looking as well. So you can achieve that look. It takes some more pruning, takes some more shaping, not personally my thing, but I could see how to somebody that would be lovely, and certainly much lower maintenance, much lower water, and much more value giving back to wildlife and to the environment than the lawn across the street from it. And so what we are going to do now is we're going to look at a bunch of slides and a bunch of examples that show kind of key elements of residential gardens. So for those of you who joined us for the favorite plants workshop, we broke up the different plants by the different kind of situations you would use them for: full blasting sun, shade trees, smaller plants to use along pathways, what to do on the north side of a house. So this is kind of going to be the complement for landscape design and structure, where we're going to be looking at elements and a series of inspirational images and talking about them. I think I was going to stop for questions, but I see that we don't have any open questions right now. So we will keep going. If you do have questions come up, remember to type them in as we go. Give me an indication of when I should stop once they accumulate. And so this is a landscape that I really, really like. Pretty simple. What you can see is there's, what we had talked about, these decent sized chunks of relatively a few number of plants. You can see there is a little bit of that. This Australian coast rosemary is growing a little bit faster than they expected. So maybe a couple of these will need to come out, but that's just fine. But generally low water plants. Our accent, this manzanita, is going to get quite a bit larger growing in. Beautiful, simple little patio space to enjoy over here. Yeah, simple, but beautiful and maintainable. So these key elements of landscape design, residential landscapes, I'm going to present them as separate just because we need some sort of organizational structure. But it's not always that way in the real world. So different spaces, like spaces for people with patios, they'll overlap with plant spaces if you have a shade tree going over. So these aren't things that are necessarily physically separate in the garden. Isn't fully this over here and that over there. But those interactions and overlapping, that's part of the fun of design, is thinking about the functional needs for your landscape and each space and then the aesthetic look that you want for each of them, and then carefully choosing each element and thinking about how they interact goes a long way to making it come out beautifully. And so kind of the flow is we're going to look at some of these spaces, and then and these elements, and then as we get to the end of the class, we'll kind of wrap it all together with one example of going through that whole design process for a specific yard. So people spaces. Well, this is a front yard that's really has, a lot of people spaces. Bench right along the sidewalk, a little free library for the community, hammock in the shade, and some really nice walking paths. So that's very people-centric. Sometimes they're wider and more flexible, and we'll look at a lot more pictures. But here's the principles of thinking about your people spaces. Create comfortable spaces that you actually want to spend time in. So if you're with us in inland Southern California, it's hot outside a lot of the years. So actually thinking through what's going to make that space comfortable goes a long way to having an outdoor living space you can actually enjoy for something that, a pergola that looks nice when you take a picture of it and show it to your friends after you pay someone a bunch of money to build it. But it turns out, like a lot of pergolas, that it actually doesn't provide shade most of the day because of the sun angles, and it's actually not a usable space. So thinking through those spaces carefully, thinking about what you need, and considering especially if you're someone who hosts a lot of social events, has a lot of family over, thinking about a yard as a series of outdoor rooms with patios, spaces for a picnic table or dining table, chairs, maybe a hammock. And most of the time, even if you put in a number of outdoor rooms in a yard, in between, you're going to provide some separation with plants. And so you can still have it feel like a garden. Definitely don't plan it to where it's all hardscape, all kind of poured concrete. But the series and the pacing between the people spaces and the plant buffers in between can be actually very beautiful. So physical comfort inside and out for a lot of Southern California, unless you're right at the beach, that's shade. So having deciduous, which are plants that lose their leaves, or evergreen shade on the west side, both of your house and of gathering spaces. So if you have an outdoor patio space that has no shade on the west side, large shrubs, shade trees, or things like that, it is going to be hot in the late afternoon and early evening. But providing a tree strategically placed on the west side of your patio space can go so far to making that space being a place that you want to be outside as soon as the sun starts going down in the evening, or just is not really high up in the sky. Even on our hot days, if you're in the shade of something like an oak tree, it can feel pretty nice outside. So prioritize casting shade, those western exposures, or in a house, even on the west or south facing windows can cool the house a lot. So your yard can actually help keep your house cool. Shade on those west facing places. And then near those places that you want to spend time in, make sure the ground feels cool as well. Cover the majority of the ground with plants and avoid more concrete, asphalt, or even permeable paving than necessary, because all of that's going to soak in and reflect the heat. So here is an example. I love seeing these patios show up in redone front yard spaces like this, because these are spaces that people actually want to spend time in. That's why they're putting the chairs out. So this is a young native garden, and mostly native, a few other accents, and really, really beautiful. So I have a few notes in these spaces of different materials that are often used. So here, the patio space is what's called decomposed granite. We'll see some other pictures of it closer up. The pathway spaces are pea gravel. Pea gravel is just a name for the small, usually locally harvested gravel, kind of iMac. Oh, sorry. I said iMac because I saw it coming on a comment off to the side. It's kind of granite is what I meant to say. I should be letting Brandon host all the comments and not keeping an eye on it. Yeah, absolutely beautiful. And this tree right here, it's young, doesn't look like much right now. This is a Desert Museum Palo Verde. This will provide a light dappled shade, so plants will still be able to grow underneath it to most of the yard and will help shelter the patio. And then on this, which I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, was, yeah, it was the west side of this landscape, is a sycamore tree. So eventually this is going to have that western afternoon shade over this landscape and that patio. Very simple. So here's a patio social space done with broken concrete. So most likely this was a concrete patio that didn't let any water soak in. Oftentimes, then that water, if it's all concrete, is going to need to rush somewhere. Oftentimes will cause problems in a backyard. This one had quite a bit of slope, so maybe there's an erosion issue. And so that patio was broken up, and then those chunks of concrete were used as paving stones, reset with that decomposed granite in between. So has a more organic look than the concrete. You can make the edge a little bit more varied, and then the water is just able to soak in through the decomposed granite. So there's not going to be water accumulating and going anywhere else. That's another picture of that same landscape coming up that I showed at the beginning of this section. So waiting for that slide to change. Here we go. So deer grass manzanita, another little front yard patio space with those Adirondack chairs. And so one key thing to think about is making your functional spaces actually function for you and how you're going to use a space. Because even if your space can accommodate it, there's no point in having a giant outdoor table with, seating for 10 if you don't have groups over that are that big. Make it function for you. So one good example of this are lawns. Do you need one? Maybe you do. If your kids are learning to play soccer and need a place to do some backyard practice, the lawn's pretty practical. If you need one small bit of lawn for your dog, that's pretty practical as well. But if it's just for your dog, probably doesn't need to be a wall-to-wall lawn in your backyard. So for a lawn, I'm not going to tell everyone you got to take out your lawn, you're a bad person, but it's really about right sizing it for what's going to work for you so you can get the most out of your landscape. And if all of us just had the amount of lawn that we would actually use, then we would have a lot less lawn. We'd be using a lot less resources. So another thing to think about, popular outdoor eating. Barbecues, dining tables, where are you going to site them? How are you going to shade them? Is the grill a convenient location from the house if you're going to be running back and forth to the refrigerator inside? Make sure that all of your locations are very practical. And as you're starting to think, this could be here, this could be over there, walk yourself through that design as it's coming to you. Think about how you would use that space on your weekdays, on your weekends, when you have people over for social events. Literally walk through, pretend that you're running outside from the refrigerator to get something onto the grill and think, is that all going to be practical? Am I going to be able to walk in a kind of straight line in between the areas that I'm going to want to be able to do that? Or what are the areas that maybe I would want to make myself meander through? Make sure everything is comfortable. And I'm a big fan of designing with your body is what I should say. It's making sure that access is going to be comfortable, making sure, like, I will go so far as if it's a dining space to lay out with flags or with chalk or something, like, where's the size of the dining table going to be? How big is it going to be? Where are the chairs going to go? How far back am I going to need to have that patio space go so that somebody could comfortably be seated in a chair at the table and someone else can walk behind them? I've definitely done that before and realized I need to make the patio space for that area maybe 2 feet wider, 3 feet wider, to have it be something where everything can be crammed in there but not be comfortable. People are kind of falling off the edge of the patio into the landscape versus having it be comfortable. And so when we're talking about lawns, there's plenty of lower water lawns available. And so a lot of these lower water lawns, we're not talking about soccer practice every day. There is a place for just plain old tough turf. But a lot of people, even who want a little bit of lawn, just for some casual play for the kids or something like that. One great example that's starting to show up more and more places is buffalo grass. It's a Southwest native grass that's deep rooted. So this is one that was on the Theodore Payne Foundation tour in Pasadena. So similar, maybe not quite as hot, but pretty similar. Then the woman gave it a deep watering once a week in the summer. Goes a little bit brown or goes partially brown in the winter, similar to St. Augustine, different look than St. Augustine, but same condition, St. Augustine grass. But yeah, pretty easy. This was prepared inexpensively by seed, similar process to seeding any other new lawn. It just grows in a little bit slower, but that also means if you want to mow it, it's like once a month mowing, even in the summer. And so another note, so this is that look decomposed granite. So you walk on this, kind of is nice and a little crunchy and natural feeling, but it is still a permeable material. It's not like pouring concrete. It can get a little mushy in a big rain event. Definitely take that into account. I wouldn't want to do the whole area like right around my house with this because I'd be tracking it in if I walked it in the rain, but great for pathways. And then I'm really a fan of steel landscape edging. It's a little more, you have to get it at the landscape supply specialty store. There's plenty around though. If you just look up landscape supply store, sometimes they'll need to special order it for you. But it's a little bit more expensive than the plastic stuff you can get at the big box hardware store, but it looks so much better. It lasts a lot longer. The plastic stuff after a few years usually heaves up out of the ground because it's not secured quite as well as the staking system for the metal edging. Just looks nice and clean. Definitely, I feel like that poured concrete mow curb in situations like this is way overused, especially in the Inland Empire area. You don't see it as much in other areas of Southern California. And it doesn't look at scale in an average size residential yard. To me, that looks like more like a huge commercial area where you have a riding lawnmower or something and really need some solid edging that vehicles could drive over, basically. Really a fan of this small, clean looking metal edging. So another example of a buffalo grass lawn. Sometimes, depending on how carefully you irrigate it, can be a little bit patchy, but if you put in like this is one probably looking at this informal space, they probably just hose watered every once in a while, probably every week or so. But if you put in like a standard, probably with a taller pop-up turf irrigation system, you'll get that full coverage as well. Looks a little bit like a shaggy Bermuda grass lawn. And also creating social spaces, maybe out of other neglected spaces that are otherwise unused. So a lot of us have a detached garage in the backyard. And in Southern California, a lot of people don't actually use their garages to store their cars. And so in this case, the cars stayed parked in the front yard. And so there was this long concrete strip in the side yard that wasn't used, built a little trellis, put a grapevine over it for shade, and there's the social space right there. It's a pretty small backyard, so a lot more functionality gained for the people spaces for the yard by doing something like that. And you can have a great outdoor kitchen without spending thousands and thousands of dollars for like a built-in outdoor kitchen. I am a big fan of just thinking through what's the good space to keep your grill, thinking through storage. Snap tight tub is great. Sometimes you can get something like this, sometimes online pretty cheap, sometimes from a restaurant supply store that kind of extend your counter space. In my backyard area where I have my grill, I knew someone who was getting rid of an old 3-bin stainless steel commercial sink. It was too beat up to be of any use to a restaurant, but way too good to throw away. And so I got that for free and now have a pretty nice outdoor kitchen setup. So definitely, you can have all those functions without having the price necessarily. And then if you do have large gatherings, thinking about how large of a paved area do you actually need? So I took this picture at Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden in one of their workshop spaces, and they needed some more space, but I really like how they didn't just pour more concrete. So the spillover area can be that permeable decomposed granite, doesn't necessarily need to be wall-to-wall concrete. And even sometimes looking at the materials that are available at the hardware store. So this was a very high-end, very fancy neighborhood landscape, but these square pavers, which look great for this use, are you can just get them at the big box hardware store. Definitely, you can on even a modest budget do great design with what's available. So this is a picture from the backyard of the place that I moved into just about a little less than a couple of years ago now. And so it's not much you can see in terms of planting design yet, but what we did have was a huge, oversized, way bigger than we needed, really broken up from some ash trees that had just been allowed to grow from seed that were too close, concrete patio. And so what we did is I rented a jackhammer from Home Depot, broke up about a third of that patio over a couple of weekends. Was a lot of physical work, but as that happened, then all of a sudden I had a bunch of building material. So I took what I broke up out of this patio, used it to create a second patio space that we would have kind of two different outdoor rooms, one more for dining, one more for relaxing, planted gardens all around them, this is part of our stormwater system that's starting to go in, a series of dry stream beds that are in now that end up at a sunken basin. That's a meadow that can flood, but is also grown in to be more of a meadow. The soil we dug out of there, we piled up this way to create a terrace that we held back with just rocks that we dug up from the yard in the process, and some of that broken concrete made a built-in bench. And so reducing paving you don't need, and then maybe potentially using those building materials for something else. We also use that for a network of broken concrete stepping stones, which then in process also form with some of those big pieces of bridge over that dry stream bed. So I will show many more pictures from this project as we do a home rainwater harvesting workshop in the winter and also in the fall, and installation and establishment of California native landscapes workshop. And then just plain old gravel. Most of the time, I don't recommend those plastic weed barriers for plant spaces and landscapes. But if you have a large area like this, where it's going to be a patio, sometimes that's useful for helping with the weeds. There's also not a lot of organic matter accumulating in it that's going to clog up all of those spaces in the fabric, which is part of what happens in the plant areas. And then the plants can't get water to their root zone over time. But think about this patio space. How would this feel if this was all concrete versus how it feels with that, looks like 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch, just natural river rock gravel? This is a lovely space. And then also just, again, thinking about the feel that you want. If you want to feel like you're camping out in the woods or the mountains, being careful with the fire and responsible, but, gravel patio space, native garden, and fire ring, backyard camping feel. Next one is a much more modern space with an almost hidden away little meadowy patio with some square pavers and some native grasses in between, a couple of slingback chairs. And another front yard, mixed native and non-native front yard. And then this nice pathway, combination of broken concrete with decomposed granite filled in, but to get a little bit more formal look that matched this neighborhood. This is a front yard, so they were going to have the most eclectic garden in the neighborhood and be just fine with that, but they wanted to have a couple of notes of formality. There was a lot of old craftsman houses there, so they combined a linear brick edging to have it kind of set a little bit of a different tone than it was if it was just broken concrete, and then surrounding by the plant spaces. I think this is absolutely lovely, certainly so much more functional than the front lawn that they replaced with it. And yeah, quite nice. Flagstone is another good option. Flagstone, if it's set in decomposed granite, is also permeable as well. So very woodland feeling, kind of informal, meandering backyard space where there's flagstone, and then that flagstone then goes to little bits of cobble and rock, which then transitions into the plant spaces. And so that is the end of those actual people space examples where people are going to gather, where people are going to spend time. Next, we're going to look at the connection spaces, pathways, and things like that in between these. But what I want to do is in between each of these concepts, we will stop and we will take a look at some questions. So a couple of questions coming in, and I could just read them off Brandon. From George, when you use mulch, what's the best way to prevent weeds from seasonally returning? It depends, unfortunately, is the answer. The most important thing to do is to do your weed abatement, your weed removal to the extent you can before you put in your new garden. So really doing a good job, whether it's turf or weeds, with smothering those weeds down. Sheet mulching or cardboard mulching is one of my favorite go-tos. Sometimes, especially if you have Bermuda grass, it's not 100% effective, but it's layering sheets of corrugated cardboard that you're going to wet down really well underneath as a temporary biodegradable weed barrier, and then putting your mulch on top. But if you have, like I do in my front yard, there's a number of houses nearby that they have Bermuda grass front lawns. They go to seed blows around some. I always have a little bit of weeding to do, but if you do a really good job on the outset, the weeding is most likely going to be doable. If you have another very specific situation that you're dealing with, I would say hang on till the end of the class and we can go into more specifics then. So another question. One friend did her garden with natives, but the designer put in a ground cover fabric. It does not allow to drain water. Should she take out that fabric? Yes, absolutely. Water, it's going to cause problem for airflow over time as well. The landscape cover fabric, which is usually made out of plastic and is marketed to be able to allow air and water to go through, does clog up eventually. And then after 5 years or so, sometimes longer, it normally starts to kind of break down. It'll never biodegrade, but it just breaks into chunks. Weeds start growing, sometimes just on top of it because there's silts and stuff that build up. And it's kind of a mess long term. It's really just kind of it's a shortcut to not doing that proper weed control ahead of time, but it catches up with you in the long run and is not a good long-term solution. And then it's a pain to take out later on. So yeah, unfortunately, I would recommend taking it out. It's just not a good long-term solution. And from William, will zero landscape be discussed later on or not into the topics? If you can type back in the question and answer and let us know more what you mean by zero landscape. I'm wondering if you are meaning xeriscape, which is a term that was more popular in like the early 90s. And really that just means low water landscape. It came more out of the Southwest where succulents were a little bit more popular than the kind of stuff that we're talking about locally, although succulents are just fine around here. But really that's just another term which has stopped being used because it's very confusing for low water landscapes. But if there's something else you're getting at, please type it back into the chat or into the question and answer. And then from Sharon, are there any native plants that can be planted and survive around an above ground pool? Yeah, lots and lots of native plants. Most plants would be just fine. You're just going to want to think about things that are soft, that are maybe depending on if you're afraid of bees or not. Some people don't like a lot of bees around the pool. They're afraid they're going to step on them. But going with grasses is usually a pretty good idea around pools. If the above ground pool is being drained, even the lower water demanding native or even southwestern grasses, they can take extra water if they need it. You always want to be a little sensitive around chlorine. I'm never going to say, oh, it's totally fine to drain your above ground pool into an area because chlorine can be an issue, but the grasses are usually pretty tough in all circumstances. And if somebody kind of walks through them or brushes against them in bare feet, it's usually not that big of a deal. Oh, so William is joining us from Arizona. So yes, low water landscape. So that's awesome that you're joining us from Arizona. I'd be curious, let us know in the chat how you heard about this. That's great that we're having people join us. But yeah, so this is really a California-based talk. So these general design principles you can definitely use, but in terms of the planting, you're going to want to look at Arizona-based resources for what's going to be low water out there, because low water in Tucson is a little bit different than even low water in Inland Empire, California. And there is, Brandon might remember the water district out there. There's a group of water districts that put out great information and have great online resources. It might come to me later.
It's water, use it wisely.
That's it. Water, use it wisely. So we have somebody with us from Canada, but still learning a ton. That's amazing. Kimberly and William. Yeah, please type into the chat, or if you're having trouble with the chat, the Q&A, let us know how you heard about this workshop. That's awesome. But yeah, very curious how you heard about us.
And Scott, in the chat, we have Jim Junio.
Okay.
But it's a very specific trying to get the look of Imperial Garden from Shanghai. It's a very detailed message. So if Jim can put in the chat his email, I can have Scott get back to you.
Yeah, and then just one quick thought for Jim, because he's talking about Chinese gardens and how to incorporate those ideas here. So a couple of things, but there are some great local botanical gardens that have Chinese and Japanese gardens. So the Huntington Library and Botanical Garden in Pasadena area in San Marino is currently closed. They're working on getting reopened soon after the quarantine. They have a lot of indoor gallery spaces as well, but they have, and I think have just opened, but their opening celebration had to be canceled. The last phase of what's the largest traditional Chinese garden outside of China happening in inland Southern California. So go check it out. Definitely not a low water garden, but in terms of getting look, they also have a Japanese garden there as well. And then there's a few other gardens, I believe, and you could look into it. I believe Santa Barbara Botanic Garden has a small, like, Japanese tea house. I know it's very different than a Chinese garden, but kind of getting that, what I'm getting at is the temperate look of that kind of piney, kind of higher water use landscape in Southern California. They have a small Japanese garden with California native plants, but there's a lot of California native plants that, especially some of the manzanitas and coffee berries and things like that, that you can get that look from. So I'm going to look at, Descanso Gardens also has one as well. And when we look at the plant resources, which we will get to before long, just look through that and think about what can capture that look. So we are going to move on right now. I see a couple other questions came in, and we will get to those in the next round of question and answer, but we will definitely get to them before long. So let's start looking at connection spaces, because this is something that is equally important and somewhere where I often see designs go wrong. You're going to have we're going to talk about plant spaces after this. You're going to have your spaces for people that we just talked about, but you need to get between the two, or even your plant spaces, you need to have a comfortable way of moving through them that's well thought out so you can enjoy them. Something that often happens these days, especially in front yards, is that people will pull out the lawn and then people will fill it full of plants. And then as the plants start growing in, 2 years later, people will stand on the sidewalk or in their driveway, scratching their head, realizing that they can't walk into their space to enjoy it or do their maintenance because they didn't leave space to walk through. Very important. And how you decide to build those spaces and how you decide to shape those spaces can have a big impact on getting the feel that you might want for your landscape. So key things before we start getting into the pictures. Plants grow. Give yourself enough room. So even though in a landscape, maybe you only need a 2-foot wide little path to walk through, if you plan and build a 2-foot wide path and then put all of your plants in, what inevitably happens is that some of the plants along the edge of the path grow wider than you think they're going to be. And when plants start growing in over a 2-foot wide path, it disappears almost immediately. If you give yourself a 4-foot wide path, 4.5. In some cases, depending on the size of the plants, even a 5-foot wide path, which might feel huge day one, especially if you're going for kind of a natural or relaxed look where you're going to want to let your plants grow a little bit over the edges of your path. Then things can grow in, and then you have your 2 to 3 feet that you can still comfortably walk in without having to start hedging the edges of all of your plants. So give yourself enough room. Be generous with your pathways if you can. And if you're going for that Southwest kind of gravel and succulents kind of look, then you kind of more in control. But if you're going for a lot of Mediterranean or native looks, your plants are going to grow a little bit more than you're anticipating. And you want to be able to play with that and not have to be too uptight about cutting back to the edge of the path. As often as you can, use permeable surfaces like broken concrete, gravel, or decomposed granite or sandset pavers for your connection spaces to let the water kind of soak in, especially if you have existing trees. Be careful. You don't want to be putting in, most of the time, if you're putting in like poured concrete pathways, they start by getting a small bobcat or something in there to dig down a few inches. And you don't want to do that in the zones where you have existing tree roots just to put in a path. So think about soft things you can do on top. And even just plain old wood chip mulch for a path is just fine. That's mostly what I do in my backyard because I like that natural feel and look, and the price is right. Consider where the eye goes as someone walks on a path and different focal points. And so a curving, meandering path, even if it's short, as you walk along it, is going to force your eye as you walk and make those curves in different directions to look at different focal points in the background. So having a curved path and then really thinking about putting one of those accent plants that's going to be just spectacular part of the year right along one of those curves, right as your eye is forced to turn a little bit, is a great design technique. Or you can have something that's very rectilinear and almost formal looking. Sometimes something that's interesting on a relatively flat site is to have a very rectilinear kind of path system and then a very wild kind of planting. And it makes a really nice juxtaposition or balance. So this is also one from the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Tour, Pasadena area, small front yard. I talk about this for other reasons in other classes because I'm really a fan of this. This was designed by the homeowner, first yard he ever did. He took a plant propagation class and grew a lot of the plants himself as well. But it really, really makes the house and the yard both feel like you're almost out in the woods and also much, much further back from the street. And it's on a side street, but kind of close to a relatively busy street. So really, really improves the feel of the landscape. But I really like this, kind of talking about this is an intimate but adequately spaced path. Very informal, 3/4 inch granite or river rock gravel. And you can see he's had to do some trimming along here, but it still works very well. And the size of the path fits the relatively small scale of the front yard. And the size of the path really helps it be an immersive experience. Maybe not the best path if this was going to be the path that you want to be able to, like me, when I'm grilling in the backyard, I'm always like running back and forth to the kitchen. I'm always like worried something's on the grill for too long, but need to grab the next thing to go on that I forgot I left in the refrigerator. This would not be the path for that. But for spending just a little bit of time around this beautiful lush planting in the front yard that you want it to feel a little bit more private and intimate, that's great. And so just another view of that yard. So still have that long driveway, detached garage off to the side. So that's out looking in. And then the last picture, we're looking at like this area. So relatively narrow, but it does so much more than the lawn that it replaced did. Here's another stabilized decomposed granite path with steel edging. And this is, I think, one of those perfect example of that, making the path a little bit wider than you actually need for the path. So that way the planting can grow into it a little bit, soften those edges, and you still have plenty of space to walk. Also, just stepping stones can be flagstone. Next picture is of my backyard when it is just starting to grow in. So you can't really see the design much. Only some of the plants are in, but that's some of that broken concrete we reclaimed from the patio. And so a lot of areas we just have mulch paths lower out, but coming in between the patio spaces, coming off of it, felt really nice to kind of match that material with decomposed granite. Another great way you can go with decomposed granite is just river rock edging as well for an even more natural kind of look. Also kind of creates a little bit more of a psychological sense of separation between the planting beds and the path, if that's what you want. And then this is actually a driveway space, not a path, but in those large paved areas like driveways, which I consider still on the kind of connection space, uh, allowing plants to just a little bit come over the edge to really soften that. If you are working with a landscape crew that takes care of your landscape and you move to something like this, you're going to have to do quite a bit of training and setting expectations with them. But something that I have had to do a lot of work with people who maintain public landscapes that I've put in is just the default for a landscaper who's working hard and doing their job is just to cut everything back to the edge of the pavement. And so this enhances the look, but just one warning, you're going to have to set expectations if you're not doing your own maintenance. A lot of people, after they make this transition, start doing their own maintenance because it's more viable and it's also more fun. But that's not for everybody. So yeah, obscuring the edges just a little bit can really help. For this, it's perfectly adequate. I'm not a fan of spending a ton of money on a fancy driveway. But especially if your driveway is older rather than newer, doesn't look that great, that's fine. But as soon as you let the plants just kind of come over the edge a little bit, it really brings your eye into the planting. Narrow side space. This is actually the side yard going into the backyard of that Pasadena front yard that we just looked at. So sometimes you just don't have room to do much in terms of design, but just a few little pots hand watered once a week or so with a hose, if they're in part shade like this, really makes a big difference in the feel of that part of the space as well, which even if it's just a pathway, this is going to be part of the experience of living in this yard on a daily basis. So might as well make it nice. So speaking of fancy driveways and spending a lot of money on it, this is a design from a local landscape architect, Josh Link, who has a company called Ecotone Studios. He is a brilliant designer. This project itself is definitely out of my price range, but is just a really innovative, I think, way of really thinking through those connection spaces, even if there's something as big as what a car needs to get through and making it work for the landscape. So for this project, all California native, very well thought out in terms of the aesthetics plant palette and very restricted. So here, a lot of it in the front is Canyon Prince Wild Rye, this bluish grass, and native white sage. And this is pretty young, so it's going to get quite a bit larger still. But this is the driveway. Took what was a big renovation. You can tell kind of very modern color palette, but took what was basically a generic suburban property with a very awkward kind of hard right turn to the garage and broke out the whole driveway. There's definitely going to be road base, if not also there's a product called Gravel Pave, which is a plastic grid that can help support gravel under vehicle weight. So did something underneath for structure, but then have these bands of concrete with the gravel infill that almost feels more like a patio space, like the little detail, the rain chain going into the planter right here. And then these irregular shaped edges going into this, really, really creating a nice look and feel for what is essentially a driveway. Absolutely beautiful design, I think. And then out in the front, just to show, I'm really a fan of a couple of things. One, so there is a fence here, but if there's going to be a fence, really not bringing it as close as possible to the property line, but allowing some amount of the front yard to be in that public space, to not totally turn your back on the neighborhood. I'm also a fan of plantings that, where there's a sidewalk involved, do something on both sides of that sidewalk that respond to each other. So the experience walking down the sidewalk is that you're actually just for a moment being brought into, invited into, and walking through a landscape or a garden. Oftentimes the sidewalk is just a random break in the design, and what happens on the parkway side is totally separate than what happens on the front yard side. And even though this fence is pretty far out, you're still invited into this kind of unique experience just for a moment. And these grasses will kind of flower and hold these flower heads up a little bit higher, and it'll just be a really nice experience walking through. but it doesn't need to be that fancy. So also looking at connection spaces and that making sure you have access to enjoy and do your maintenance in your front yard could definitely be as simple as, it could just be mulch, but if you want it to be a little bit more defined than that, here's some flagstone with some gravel in between. Very simple, easy, do-it-yourself kind of project. This is an example from part of my young backyard where we just have mulch we got for free, little bit defined on the edge with, and this is also for habitat value, and we'll talk about this later on, not later on this class, but later on when we do our class focused on habitat, we are going to really talk about the different elements. But here we have our mulch pathway, little bits of rock and gravel. We have some branches that we reused from some trees that had to be trimmed hard or come down in the backyard when we moved in because they were hazardous, and creating just a very natural feel in this lower part of the yard, which is partially set aside for wildlife habitat. These are dried annual wildflowers, which after their beautiful phase, we leave around for a little while and then eventually move to a final lower area in our yard that's very wild because the songbirds will come and pick these apart for the ripened seed in them, spreading seed to bloom in other places of the yard next year as they get their own nutrition. And so that's just a few things to think about as you're thinking about how you connect your different spaces. And we are going to transition soon to plant spaces, but let's get back to questions and answer what came in. Let's see. Let's start. Do you want to read these, Brandon? I jumped on them last time, but people can probably use a little break from my voice.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm trying to answer a couple of them. So Jim typed his question in here. I think you kind of covered that one. So we have one from Pam Ellen. What are good companion plants for spiky shaped plants?
Companion plants for spiky shaped plants. So oftentimes, and it might depend on whether you're talking about spiky like cactus or spiky like there's kind of native rushes like juncus, which are kind of like hard grass like plants that are somewhat low water but kind of occur in wet areas. So let me know if I answered the wrong thing, Pam. But oftentimes either of those are both kind of very sculptural forms. And so oftentimes I'll contrast the sculptural forms with something that's looser. So that is going to be oftentimes for me a shrub on the medium or small side, something like, depending on the water requirements, something like Allen Chickering or Pozo Blue native sage, maybe our native white sage. If you're looking for smaller plants, some of the California native penstemons, maybe hummingbird sage. If you're talking about the juncus and it's a kind of lowish but still gets some water, maybe a ground cover of the native yarrows, or if it's shady, the native strawberry are all good things that really provide a strong contrast and a good look. And then if you're looking for something that is a little bit different than that, depending on what you're looking at, sometimes some of the native or Southwest grasses are good. So that could be something like our California native deer grass or its Texas cousin, pink mully grass, can be good examples of that as well. And
okay, so then we have just one more. So does wood mulch attract termites, or is there wood mulch that doesn't attract termites?
Okay, great question. And it's a question that we get somewhat often. In the 15-ish years that I have been working with wood mulch, I have never seen termites congregating in it, nor have heard of or experienced any issues with it. With that, I might put a caveat, which is I can't guarantee it. I mean, termites eat wood, but my instinct is that they prefer more sheltered places and larger chunks of wood. So I've never seen that as an issue. Certainly, they're only interested in organic things. So if you're worried about it, depending on your planting, a mix of decomposed granite or gravel mulches, and we'll look a little bit about that in just a minute. Would be a definite opportunity to be fully confident. But yeah, I've just not experienced it as an issue. And I guess we can cover this one as well.
Okay.
So Jim asked, any design resources on false perspective? Short answer is no. And feel free to type in, Jim, and we can get around to it the next time. I might not fully understand what false perspective is. I will mention, because it didn't come up, I don't think it comes up specifically in this class. I think we talk about it more in some of the other classes that are more focused on planting design. But one of the keys to making a smaller space feel bigger is to work carefully with your layering, putting larger plants in the background, medium-sized plants in the middle ground, and smaller plants in the foreground. And by including all of those layers, it just naturally is going to build a sense of depth that is often missed when people, or even professional landscape designers, but especially home designers, oftentimes when they move to a Waterwise plant palette, it ends up being a lot of medium-sized plants, maybe a few small plants, and kind of interspersed in between the medium ones, and then maybe like one or two large ones, a couple of small trees or something like that. But it ends up being the middle ground is all medium-sized plants, and sometimes most of it is medium-sized plants. So having a swath in the foreground of whatever the main perspective is of smaller material, maybe with a couple of smaller accents, so it's not just too much, intermix a little bit, but mostly lower plants in the foreground with some accents, mostly middle plants in the mid ground, and maybe with some accents, some contrast between those plants, and then taller plants, whether it's an informal hedge or trees in the farthest back layer, really builds a sense of depth. I'm looking out into my front yard right now where we did that, but realizing that the main perspective is actually from sitting inside for the front yard looking out, we built that out from the perspective of the house. So looking out first to the smaller plants, then to the medium plants, and then to the taller plants, which are closer to the sidewalk. And then also adding in some smaller plants out at the sidewalk. So where the garden doesn't really turn its whole back to the neighborhood. That's really provided much more of a sense of depth and a sense of space than the actual measured out depth of the landscape would provide otherwise. So hopefully that's of help, but useful to talk about for design anyways. And so let's move on, and then we're going to do a section on plant spaces, and then we'll wrap back around and do another quick round of questions and answers for whatever comes in. So plant spaces, and again, there's an intermingling of all of these things, but this just seemed like a logical way to organize it for me. Wanted to start with this picture. This is from the Native Plant Garden Tour. Again, design was done by the homeowner. This was I think West San Fernando Valley, really deep front yard, really large property, quite a lot of landscape to maintain. And especially if this was wall-to-wall plants and it was the homeowner doing the maintenance, it would feel like quite a lot. So I'm really a fan of their design solution, which was to put in this generously wide network of decomposed granite paths. This looks like it's probably maybe a 5-foot path even. And then a mixture of some ground covers, some large perennials, and some shrubs and some trees. And it creates really what's a relatively low maintenance and overall almost like a botanical garden or a public park-like effect in their front yard. So it's definitely going to be lower maintenance than the lawn that it probably replaced. Lot cheaper once you get to this scale in terms of the water use. Decent amount of color. You can see there's some, not really a formal design, but there's some repetition of these verbenas. This is Verbena delamina, California native verbena that attracts a ton of butterflies. And so it kind of shows up in multiple planting beds for some continuity. And so not super fussy with the design, not super fussy with the materials, didn't cost an arm and a leg, but maintainable, quite nice wildlife habitat, and turns their front yard basically into a park. So I think that's probably part of their design goals and fits that very well. Next up is going to be a series of spaces. This is actually a private school in La Cañada, northern San Gabriel Valley, that I've only been to this on the garden tour. I'm not sure the function of this building, but it's an older kind of semi-Spanish style building with a woodland plant palette, which I think is just lovely. It's not bare bones low water, but it's quite low water, and has a combination of decomposed granite pathways. This kind of pulls together a little bit of everything we're talking about, but I just stuck it in plant spaces because there's a lot of plants in it. But for that primary walkway, still going to be concrete, but the secondary ones through the garden, decomposed granite, just very naturally blending into the mulch, wood chip mulch at the edge, some stone worked in, some native shrubs and grasses, definitely doing the rainwater harvesting and capture thing. Nice, simple, not super expensive, but very functional little bridge over it. These are native grasses, which in the summer, this small strip, which is on little microspray irrigation, probably still gets water about once a week. But then these shrubs farther out might be on drip irrigation out there. They only need a deep soak about once a month. Very naturalistic feeling, very elegant landscape that just fits so perfectly with the architecture as well. Absolutely gorgeous. Waiting for the next slide to come in, have a little bit of a lag. So mixing that small grass with some dwarf native coffee berry, some more of that Canyon Prince wild rye that we saw in the other project. And again, if this was a house, it doesn't need to be all or nothing on the lawn. So this is a beautiful native garden, but there's still a strip of lawn on the outside. It's very functional for a school. They probably have some amount of student drop off and pick up there. And, that's just a lawn is a useful space for public gatherings or functions like that, but they didn't need lawn to be the whole thing. Looking at some more intimate spaces and how it comes together with the people spaces and the connection spaces. It's a project I believe in Hollywood by another Southern California landscape architect, Studio Prechicor. And this is a semi-shaded area. So these coral bell hook-reds, which are beautiful, aren't going to work, especially inland in full sun. But I like this, again, talking about layering to make the most out of a narrow space. So we have our taller informal shrub layer. And in a lot of landscapes, it would just be the shrub and that would be it. And eventually you would feel like there's the shrub right up against you as you're walking. But there's just very narrow band at the base of this shrub layer that has the mixture of the heucheras, and this is going to be some sort of native sedge, maybe western meadow sedge, really provides more of a sense of depth, more of a sense that you're in a garden as you walk through. And again, looks like it's probably steel landscape edging, and then to kind of balance out the formal informal, integrating the brick, the flagstone, and the pea gravel, which is the name for the smaller size gravel fill. And this might actually be, pea gravel is common, but if you're going for a really small size gravel, there's a smaller size of gravel called bird's eye gravel, which is very useful for just that little dusting in certain areas. Now, these areas like this, I really love this look of mixing gravel with the larger areas. Just one note of caution. Over time, eventually, some of this gravel does get kicked onto things like this flagstone or nearby concrete or brickwork, and that can be a bit of a trip hazard. So definitely, if there's a lot of people where mobility is an issue or coordination or worrying about slip and fall, definitely take that into account. This will have to be swept off every once in a while. And so this project, pretty fancy neighborhood, but the reason why I wanted to show this, not that I would be suggesting that you put in a fountain like this in your yard, although if that's the look you're going for and in your budget, go for it. And I'm sure that there's birds that stop by and drink out of this fountain as well. But just showing that idea of working with a formal layout, very traditional garden shape, but then a little bit more of that informal planting along the edge of it can blend together and be really nice. Then kind of moving through in this landscape to a bit more of an informal zone, you see still with flagstone. I think they actually saw cut an old flagstone patio and then reuse those as similar to like other examples I showed, reusing broken concrete. And then with decomposed granite as well, kind of getting a little bit farther away from the more formal spaces. Here's going kind of in the opposite direction to a really informal, more woodland fill. This is a garden that was designed by the director of horticulture at the Theodore Payne Foundation, Tim. And also, I think it's maintained, and I think there was some additional design work by Deerbrush Design. And very lovely, informal. But again, look at the what they're doing on the ground plane in terms of design. You still have a strong path, and then intermixing rock with that wood chip mulch, getting a more natural look than if it was just that wall-to-wall wood chip mulch. It's relatively young, so there's some trees that are still growing in, and then just little bits of California poppies and clarkias. It's wildflower amongst some grasses and other shrubs. And especially if you're working with drip irrigation, if you want to add in a couple of fruit trees that are going to need more water, that's just fine. You could put in an additional valve and just have a few rings of drip irrigation at the base of, here we have a fig and a young, what looks like it's probably a kumquat tree. And yeah, I really, really like the informal look. And again, here you can see something that we've seen in one of the other ones where there's the traditional high traffic concrete walk that goes up to the door, and then bisecting it just for the garden path, there's just a very informal, much smaller decomposed granite strip. Everything being concrete in this yard might kind of take away from that look, but it's well balanced between the concrete, the stone, even a few just branches that were probably prunings from some other plants here, and that decomposed granite. And then last example, I believe, in this section is wanted to show this relatively old and grown in front yard. This is in Woodland Hills, far west San Fernando Valley, but it still gets really hot out there, very similar to Inland Empire. And I wanted to show this as the last one for a couple of reasons. One, I liked showing a little bit more mature landscape. Two, this was designed by the homeowners who I spoke with the homeowner one of the years that I visited it on the tour, and she was really one of the first people in her neighborhood, if not the first person, to be interested in native plants. And I believe she was just inspired from hiking in the local woods and wanted to capture a little bit of that at home. So went to work on it. And their front yard, it's a pretty large property. Their front yard is quite deep. They planted the tree canopy layer, and their pathways, just decomposed granite, no edging, just kind of blending into the mulch, working with a little bit of stone off to the side there, and then shrubs. So very, very loose and informal. They still have, as you'll see on the next picture after it loads, long asphalt driveway. So when you're on the driveway, you're kind of out looking in, but because they worked with some decent sized shrubs, and you get glimpses more in as you get farther out, but because they worked with some trees and then decent sized shrubs, these are manzanitas and a western redbud, as soon as you're inside, you're really immersed in this really lovely experience. And the design itself is not formal and fussy. It's kind of a bit of a plant collection of interesting plants, but there still is that layering effect where there's the tallest shrub, the toyon, and then smaller manzanitas in front of it. And then lower, looks like it's probably some hummingbird sage and some little maybe irises. Very informal. Mixture of then the mortared flagstone at the step and the stepping stones out of flagstone. The woodwork on this house is beautiful. I think the husband of the couple has a whole wood shop in his garage and does beautiful work. But the garden is very informal, but just absolutely lovely. And then as you go around to the side and the back, I love just the mulch in between the flagstones. They have a trellis just covered in native grape on the side. And then, again, very informal flagstone to stone to mulch in the back. A little pots with a couple of cacti that they like here and there. That interaction between the different materials, the mulch, the decomposed granite, and the rock, in addition to the plant material, really does so much to set the tone and the mood for this garden in this space. So some notes on mulch, because this is one of the areas where I see people go wrong so often. So what is mulch? Mulch really just means something that's covering and essentially shading the soil. It's something on top of the soil. Traditionally, and it's not used this way much anymore, but mulch was even just roughing up and loosening up the soil on the top, like in dry farming, where in parts, usually not in the Inland Empire, I don't think, although possibly, but different parts of California, especially, they would do dry farming, no irrigation, really traditionally, before the irrigation and the waterways were so connected. And they would just, with hose, break up the top of the soil to stop the soil from wicking water out of the soil. And that was considered mulch, the soil itself just broken up. That's kind of a side note. But mulch is just something covering and shading the soil. Oftentimes people refer to wood chips as mulch, but mulch could be anything else. It could be gravel mulch, it could be decomposed granite mulch. And it's important because, one, it generally helps with the weeds, although weeds can grow in it, especially depending on the material. Two, it covers and helps keep the soil cool. And especially if we are working with plants from, whether it's California itself or lavenders and rosemaries from the Mediterranean basin, one of the defining aspects of Mediterranean climates, and so therefore the adaptations of the plants that grow in it, are they're mostly adapted to cool, wet winters and hot, dry summers. That's our weather pattern. That's what makes something a Mediterranean climate. So like deserts are hot and dry too, but they get a lot of their rainfall in summer thunder showers, which is very different than our pattern. So that being said, those plants have varying degrees, but in sometimes critically, sometimes less so, depending on the plant, they don't have that much adaptation to having soils that are wet and hot at the same time. And there are certain, mostly fungal pathogens that grow in those situations that plants, like true desert plants, have had to deal with that, evolutionarily speaking, because of their summer thunder showers, and so have resistance. But some of our native plants, especially things, for those of you who know native plants, beautiful plants like woolly blue curls or Vermontodendrons, you hear you water them once in the hot weather and you might kill them. It's because they have no adaptation for that. So most of us, those are one of the reasons why for beginning gardeners, don't recommend those plants. But a lot of our native plants can handle, you say that, once a month deep soak in the summer. But they can handle it a little bit better if they have something covering the soil, even if it's just some gravel or some decomposed granite or a little bit of wood chip. Eventually, they'll start dropping their own leaves, build up their own leaf litter, and self-mulching, and that's always the best kind of mulch in a natural environment. So we have different choices, those common ones being decomposed granite, gravel and rocks, cobble, boulders, or wood chips. So choose your mulch to match both what the plant wants and the look you want. If you're wondering what the plant wants, do a little bit of research or think about where that plant comes from. If you're mimicking an oak woodland or any kind of woodland with plants, both the tree canopy and plants that tend to grow in the understory of that woodland, like native strawberries or things like that, sometimes manzanitas, depending on the species, wood chips are great for woodlands. That's kind of mimicking the natural buildup of that organic matter. Fruit trees in Southern California, they want wood chips for sure, or kind of general mixed arborist trimmings kind of mulch. Things that like rich soil. For things that come from drier areas, so we could be talking chaparral plants, whether it's like ceanothus or some of the sages, coastal sage scrub kind of stuff, or even like Mediterranean slopes. Horticulturally speaking, gravel, decomposed granite, or rock is going to be closer to what they want. I mean, they develop some of their own leaf litter, but they don't grow in high organic matter areas. So that's going to be more of a natural covering. And then realistically, though, I do like to kind of mix things, both for aesthetic and also because when those plants grow, they're not generally recolonizing a fully open space. And so if you do wall-to-wall gravel and then put your plants into it, that first summer things can be really, really hot. So sometimes I'll do just a light covering of wood chips near it in the areas that will eventually be grown over and become self-mulching with the leaves of the own plant. Hopefully that makes sense. One critical thing for all kinds of mulch, you don't want it to go right up against the base of your plants. You usually want at least 3 inches in every direction from the stem or from the trunk. On larger trees, I might go a little bit farther because if the stem or the trunk is buried, it can cause moisture to accumulate and sit there and can cause things to rot. And then if needed, I don't hesitate for even for plantings that are more on the dry side, don't necessarily want the wood chips like mixed native plantings. A lot of times when I plant a native garden in my planting design, the planting bed is going to fully grow in. There's not going to be much, if any, open space in between those plantings. So then they will start self-mulching. But before that, before they grow in, I'll just do a light layer, maybe 2 inches of wood chip. If you're doing the turf removal rebate, they require you to do 3 inches of whatever mulch. That's fine, not too close to the plants. And then by the time that that breaks down, in most areas, I won't ever have to replace it because things will just start self-mulching after that. And I'll just go through and make sure that the self-mulch doesn't really bury the stems or the trunks every couple of years, even just kind of look around, poke around. So hopefully that helps. Here's just one good example of what I think is inorganic gravel or decomposed granite mulch done well. It's a little bit of everything. And this is somebody who just came into the Waterwise Community Center one day when I was helping cover the front desk, and we started talking about things, and he showed me this picture on his phone and asked him to send it to me because I think it's done really well. Look at how different this feels than those kind of, and this is still has a lot of growing in to do, but look at how different this feels than those typical like wall-to-wall, 3/4 inch, just one size of gravel. He has the small pea gravel, the small rocks, couple of boulders, over here, one section of decomposed granite, all well chosen for the plants. And you know, the plants themselves, they're not going to care too much with the inorganic, which version it is. But aesthetically, this is varied, it's natural looking, it's beautiful. It really enhances the yard rather than just kind of wall-to-wall typical one kind of gravel comes off the back of a truck and is spread out over the landscape. It definitely takes a little bit more effort to put in, but definitely worth it. And then also looking at pros and cons of kinds of mulches. Inorganic mulch wood chips you can often get for free. Our program is not active right now. We're kind of changing some safety protocols because of COVID-19, but we often twice a month give away free mulch. You have to pack it and take it yourself with your own tools at the Waterwise Community Center. There's a service called Chip Drop where tree trimmers, you can sign up for them to leave their mulch at your house. There's some pros and cons about that, plenty of information online about that, so check it out. So wood chip, the price is right. But if it's an area where it's not that one and done with the wood chip, but that you're going to need to have space that you continually refresh, it's going to break down. And every few years, you're going to need to get more and do that work, where the inorganic mulches, put them there once and they're there forever. And so here's just an example. Sometimes you take what you can get, but for plant health and for the soil biodiversity, the biodiversity in the soil microorganisms, things like that, really mixed arborist trimmings where there's some small stuff, there's some larger material, even some sticks and chunks. That's really what's going to be best. And then a last note on the plant part of it is make sure to keep it maintainable. So something that I always ask people when they are working with me on a design is how much time will realistically be spent maintaining the garden? Are you going to do it yourself or are you going to hire someone? And make sure that they set themselves up for long-term success. Because what most often happens is I'll ask someone how much time is going to be spent maintaining the garden. And the first answer I get will be, well, I guess I could spend like 6 hours on a Saturday and maybe a couple hours after work this day. And what initially people go to when they're excited and they're in the planning phase of their garden is what is the maximum amount of time in an ideal world that I can find myself spending time in the garden. And that doesn't set you up for long-term success because something always happens. A family member gets sick, you get busy at work, you realize you don't like gardening as much as you thought you would, something. Uh, and so if you're going to be doing all the work yourself and you're excited about it, if you're new to it, don't take out your front lawn and your back lawn all at once. Start small, be successful, understand the amount of work it's going to take, and kind of build on your success from then. And if you know you just want a nice landscape, you're happy to do the work yourself, but you're not going to become a hobbyist gardener, then consider strong groupings or blocks, kind of that repetition of, for like a front yard, average front yard, no more than 5 to 12 or so different low maintenance plants, well selected, one or two larger, kind of maybe patio scale trees, 20-foot or so trees if you have room for a couple, a handful of different shrubs or medium-sized plants, and some lower stuff to tie it all together. Keep it relatively simple. You can always make it more complex if you want to over time, add in new things. But if you start really complex and it's too much for you to learn all the plants, their maintenance needs, do all that sort of stuff, it's really hard to go back from there. So set yourself up for success, and that can be lovely. Having too many different plants, too complicated of a design, can take what should be a relaxing and fun hobby and make it more of a chore. If you're a plant nerd and you want to build a plant collection, that's fine. The backyard that my partner and I share, she's a professional horticulturist as well. We have 225, I think, varieties and cultivars, species of California native plants. We have 20-something fruit trees. The backyard is why we bought the property. It was trashed and we wanted to put in kind of our own mini botanical garden. And it is a ton of work. And sometimes it's more work than we want to put into it, but ultimately it's worth it to us. If that's not what you're going for, keep it simple. So next slide is a relatively simple, I think very beautiful front yard where it requires, I believe I talked to the homeowner who's taking out his trash cans. I think he said he has someone come about once a month and do some work periodically throughout the year. And so it's an oak tree, a row of kept small Howard McMahon manzanita on the left. So in the part shade, some Ceanothus Yankee Point, which is California lilac, spreading ground cover, some blue chalk sticks, simple ground cover succulent, and then some accents here or there. But the main bones of the garden are very nice looking, but very simple, keeps everything very maintainable. And then this next image, I think I showed in the workshop last weekend, but showing it again because it's a great example. Very simple, maintainable. Toyon, California native, reliable large shrub along the sidewalk, blue chalk sticks, senecio or blue finger, manzanita, or sorry, not manzanita, senecio, and a row of native sages, some more native sages kind of continuing over there, and then just a few accents here and there, a couple of succulents. So very simple bones, but very well chosen, very low maintenance, and then some accents to play around with, some extra pops of color and contrasting form. Simple, maintainable, does everything well, provides a little bit more sense of separation from what's a pretty busy street over on the other side, lots of pedestrian traffic in this neighborhood, does everything the landscape needs to do, way better than the lawn that it probably replaced, very easy to maintain. So putting plants together, learn and respect the plant needs, group plants with similar needs, look up the mature size of each plant. So this goes back to that right plant, right place. It's important enough that I am putting it in again. Respect the space plants need, but don't isolate them. So if a plant says it's going to get 6 feet wide, expect it to get 6 feet wide when you do the research, but no need to go kind of one plant here, one plant there in a sea of mulch or gravel. If you're working on paper, and we're going to look at some resources if you want to kind of learn how to lay it all out on graph paper, I'll give you a resource for that. That's free to learn how to do that. But remember layering and time. So if you draw your 25-foot wide tree on there, remember that everything underneath it's going to be full sun for the first number of years. So take that all into account. It's easy to lose track of that when you're doing the drawing. And then as you go, observe and learn from what works and what doesn't work. So I'm going to do a quick demonstration of the Inland Valley Garden Planner, and then we are going to go into a break. So for those of you who have seen the Inland Valley Garden Planner demonstration and you want to take your break early, go for it. And then we're going to take our 10-minute break and start back up with questions and then finish the presentation. So want to show the Inland Valley Garden Planner, which is our resource that we created for choosing the best plants for Inland Valley, whether it's built for the Inland Empire, Southern California, but definitely if you're in the San Gabriel, San Fernando Valley, equally as good. If you're in kind of more coastal areas, Orange County, Los Angeles proper, more of the beach areas of Southern California, San Diego, all of these plants are still going to be good for you as long as you're doing that right plant, right place, matching the sun, thinking about drainage and all of that. The only thing is that the irrigation information, you'll probably get away with being able to irrigate a little bit less, probably 10 to 20% less because it's just hotter out here. So have profiles here of 350 top plants for this area. And if you find choosing plants very overwhelming or just want pre-coordinated plant sets, we have some here, and we are about to be adding another 8, which will have kind of, after doing a design assistance program for a couple of years, we feel like we have a good grip on what are the top things that people are wanting for their landscapes these days. Some people want succulents, some people want a desert look, but not necessarily focused on succulents. A lot of interest in California native stuff, whether it's a woodland or really colorful California natives, a lot of interest in habitat, and then also still a decent amount of interest in like Mediterranean kind of classic landscapes. And so we're going to be adding additional and also kind of pared down, less plants to choose from, plant palettes for all of those by halfway through July with additional information. We are also working on a whole landscape design template system, which will be launched here as soon as that's ready. That'll probably be going online sometime in the fall. But to get into it, each of these has a pre-coordinated series of trees, shrubs, perennials, ground covers, talk about the horticulture preference, the moisture needs. We give moisture needs in the number of inches of supplemental water, so irrigation water, that things are going to require, because everyone's irrigation system is set up differently. We can't tell you water for 15 minutes. That's meaningless. But we do have additional information and links to help you understand how long do you need to run your irrigation system, for example, to get that 1 inch of water down into the ground, that one time a month that in the summer this landscape is likely to need after it's established. So it takes a little bit of figuring out. We also have a whole bunch of classes on irrigation coming up that are going to be presented in a similar format to today, going all through the summer. So definitely join us for those, because you really need to understand your watering in order to be successful with your design. That's key in Southern California, and it doesn't happen just by wishful thinking. So each one of these plants then, wherever you click on them, is also going to have its own detailed plant profile with its own series of pictures to give you an idea of what you're getting with the plant, its own description, its own water needs. So if you're going beyond those pre-chosen palettes, match like water needs with like water needs. Some of them, for example, there's 2 low irrigation use schedules, and there's a little bit of overlap. So you can look intentionally. We know plants don't really in the real world say, I'm schedule 1, I'm schedule 2. There is some overlap. And so we really worked hard to try to make this very usable. Some of them clearly won't work together, but some of them will. And then you get all the basic details: height, width, flower color, flower season. And then once you have it in the ground, you're also going to need to know how to maintain it. Either if you're maintaining it yourself or if you're having someone else maintain your landscape. Even though these plants are all relatively simple to maintain, just most gardeners, just professional gardeners still just don't know how to maintain them yet. So just providing your gardener, if you have a gardener working for you with, just kind of cut and paste this out, put together something maybe that helps them identify the plants, what they look like, and how to maintain them, will help protect your investment. So those are some of the features. You can also create your own login, so you can save your own lists of plants. You can get kind of downloadable formatted versions of this information if you want. But the real heart of this website is the plant finder, which we are going to now. And so this is where, after you have kind of have your head around your design, you've thought through all of those things and you've kind of thought, okay, I know where I'm going to set up my social spaces. My patio is going to be this big. I'm going to have a pathway. You get all of that kind of figured out. We're going to look in just a moment when we go through the examples of how to get that down for on paper to figure it out, whether you're drawing it on graph paper to scale or not. But what happens is your yard starts to become sectioned into more easy to figure out chunks, you can say, for the planting. And so you get to a point where, you know, I'm going to want one large tree here. I'm going to want one medium-sized tree to shade the west side of my patio space over there. And then once I have that, maybe I need, you know, 5 shrubs in that area and 1 or 2 small things to go right along the edge of the patio, rather than looking at an entire blank slate backyard and wondering where to start. And so, for example, if you want to say, I'm looking at plants to edge my patio, and I want a perennial plant that are low water, that can take full sun, and that attract butterflies. And oh yeah, I also have poorly draining clay soil. Well, now from 350 plants, you're down to 5 top choices for that situation. And so it really helps you get a jump start on making things less intimidating, helps accelerate your research, and giving you then fewer choices. And then you can look through each one and make your decisions from there. So that's the Inland Valley Garden Planner. We are always adding new content. So check back and hope that that's useful for you. If you are super into California native plants, there is another website with much more detailed information, much more native plants, gets into the rare stuff as well, called Calscape. It's calscape.org. For the average person who doesn't really want to fully go down the gardening rabbit hole, there's going to be maybe way too much information on there. So that's the Inland Valley Garden Planner. And one other thing I wanted to mention is there's a great YouTube channel called Landscape Integrity Films and Education that has great content on California native plants, beautifully shot videos, really easy to understand. So check that out as well. And so with that, what we'll do, it's 11:27. Let's take our break. We'll take a 10-minute break if you need to use the restroom, get something to drink, something like that. And so at 11:37, we will start back up and go into the rest of the presentation. And we will talk then. And we'll start with question and answer. So if you have questions, put them in and we'll start with that. And talk to you in 10 minutes. Okay, we're going to be getting started again in just about 30 more seconds, 11:37. And we'll start with some questions and answers. Brandon, if you're back, do you want to read out the questions we have?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so from Garrett, his question is, what about gophers? Any plants to avoid?
All right. Gophers, unfortunately, like most plants. I mean, they love figs, the fruit tree. So that might be one to be wary of, but they will eat almost anything and they don't go away by wishful thinking. So you're going to generally need to have a strategy if you have a lot of gophers. Some people trap them, and depending on how you feel about that, that is one solution. If you are going to be coexisting with them, then gopher cages might be needed for some of your plantings. Might not be practical to do for every small plant. You might just need to hope for some luck, but you can get or make gopher cages out of basically chicken wire that you put the root balls of your plants into, and they stick up a couple inches above the soil. They're kind of don't look great at first, but then eventually your plants will grow over them. Can be a lot of work to put together. I don't like to recommend specific companies, but there's only one company that I know that makes this product called Diggers. I think if you just Google Diggers gopher cages, you'll find them. And they make ones out of a chicken wire type material that's the right size for keeping gophers out, even young ones. And the box or the basket ship flat, and then you just kind of pull them open and fold the corners up underneath. And so it saves a ton of time. I've used those in some cases in the past where I have to. But yeah, gophers can be an issue. I don't recommend poisoning them under any circumstances. A lot of the poisons can have secondary accumulation into things like birds of prey and coyotes, and that can cause all sorts of bad problems.
Okay, the next one's from Eleanor. So, what's the best landscape design solution for a property that has grading problems where the rainwater runs towards the house?
That can be a tricky one. The real answer is it goes beyond what we can really get to today, and unfortunately, it's very, very site specific. So one solution might be to get in touch with a local landscape designer or landscape consultant. I never recommend any specific company, but one of the designers that we mentioned, Studio Petrichor, is located in Altadena, so they're right in your neighborhood. So that's the only reason why I am mentioning them. And then also there are some great examples of rainwater harvesting at the Los Angeles Arboretum that have been put in and talked about. Maybe you can find information online about it by Lee Adams, who is an Altadena resident who put in the first permitted rainwater harvesting landscape in Los Angeles County, and she's in Altadena as well. We also do a whole class on residential landscape water harvesting, which talks a lot of water harvesting is turning basically the water that's a problem into a solution that enhances your landscape. So that's what I'm talking about, water harvesting. But essentially, you're going to want to get the water away from your house, either by intersecting it in something like a dry stream bed or what's called an infiltration basin before it reaches your house, or doing something so the water can get, I'm not sure where your front yard or your backyard is, how much property you have, if you get the water around the side of your house and do something beneficial with it over there. Those are going to be kind of your two answers. It's going to be kind of slow it down, capture it somewhere. Also, depending on what is in the yard before it gets to your house, sometimes, if you're like taking out a compacted lawn and putting in a a mixed garden with roots of different depths, and wood chip mulch can kind of slow down the water enough that it gives the soil more time to capture it. But you likely will have to do some digging as well. And yeah, join us in the winter for our rainwater harvesting class as well. And we'll talk a lot more about grading and hopefully we'll give you some ideas.
Okay, we have another one. How much distance should be between the house foundation and the landscaping?
Depends on the plants and depends on your irrigation system. So for small plants, perennials and things like that, I'll let them get right up to the house. So things like yarrow or strawberries and kind of shadier areas, or small flowering things, even some accent shrubs. Trees, it's going to depend on the size of the tree, but most trees you wouldn't have closer than 5 feet from your house. But if you look at the actual canopy size of the tree, most trees you're going to want farther away. Where people really come into problems is big trees planted too close to the house where their primary roots will be there, but their canopies are going to be growing way into the house anyway. So it's just never a good idea. And then if you do have plants closer to your house, definitely make sure spray irrigation is not blasting your house. That can cause damage to your structure. Sometimes a good solution is to, even if you have spray irrigation in the rest of your yard, for that planting right near your house, to work with inline drip irrigation. And I'm about to plug all our upcoming irrigation related classes. So there's a drip irrigation class we have coming up in August that might help for that.
Okay, another one. Is a rose garden an unrealistic fantasy in a place like Pomona?
No, you can definitely have what you want. The question would be, it would take quite a bit of work and quite a bit of water to have a wall-to-wall rose garden, but to have a small collection of roses, that's just fine. Like I love growing fruit trees and vegetable gardens, which take as much, if not more, fertility and water than growing roses. So go for it. But just like a lawn, how many roses do you really want? Sometimes if you're really into roses, a small, collection of 8 to 12 roses, really nicely laid out with a path going through the middle, and then surrounded by more kind of climate adapted plantings, can be really nice. You're going to want to add compost to the soil, build up as much organic matter as you can to hold on to that water. You're going to want to mulch. You're going to need to fertilize some, and put in a good irrigation system so you can give them a good, even, deep soak, maybe about twice a week, and you should be good.
Yeah, so if you can kind of talk about when our garden is going to open, and then how we do have roses actually on display in our garden, because that'll take two questions.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a question about when the Waterwise Community Center will be opening up. So that's our building and our demonstration garden. Our demonstration garden, we're trying to get open as soon as possible. We'll definitely have an announcement on our website and in our newsletter, but we're looking at 2 to 4 weeks. We're just kind of figuring out last logistics, and then we will be open, probably looking at being Tuesday through Saturday, and maybe slightly limited hours, but we're working on getting the garden up as soon as possible. It'll probably be quite a bit longer for the building, to where we'd start up like live workshops again. We'll be doing online workshops for quite a while instead. Perfect. And then we do have a few roses at the Waterwise Community Center. It's not a prize-winning rose garden, but we do have some roses and fruit trees as well, just to show that it can be done. And why don't we hold the rest of the questions towards the end, because it's 11:45 already. We still have lots of stuff to cover. And then I will definitely stay till well after noon to answer questions. So let's get into it. And some of this stuff is going to be kind of teasers for upcoming workshops that are other things that you should be thinking about. We're really not going to get deep into the content. Just want to mention them as aspects you should be thinking about in your design. And then if you want to really learn how to do it, join us for those other workshops and we'll get way into it. So one note, you can do the design, you can have the low water plants and still have a high water landscape. Brandon runs a landscape audit and irrigation assistance program where we help people understand what's going on with their irrigation system, so we don't fix breaks, but we will basically do consultations, give advice, and timer settings. How much should they be watering in our local service area? And we see this very often. People will put in the plants, and either the irrigation timer might still be set on a lawn schedule, or it will be set at that like once a week watering deep soak for that, intended for that first year, so the plants can get its roots out into the ground. And it might be 5 years later and it just never changed. And so that's not only wasting water, but it's actually not great for the plant health. And so the one thing I can really cover about that is it's not really optional to kind of understand watering if you're going to be putting the effort, time, expense into doing this. So join us for one of our summer or fall irrigation workshops. Have the whole schedule coming up. So take a look at those, or you can also check online on our website, cbwcd.org. I will let you know some of these are not up on the website yet. By the end of next week, they will all be up and you'll be able to register for those all. These are all going to be online workshops in the same format as this. So another kind of thing to think about is spaces for wildlife. We talked about people, we talked about plants, and the wildlife spaces and the plants are definitely a big overlap. Here is the picture of what turned into a wildflower and pollinator garden this last spring. This is the broken concrete patio that I had showed the picture of that I built in my backyard. And we had so many birds in our wildflowers last year that they spread seeds all over the place. And just the little cracks that we filled with soil between the broken concrete became a wildflower garden, which we loved at my house. We kind of loved the wilder look and thought that this was awesome. You can get your yard certified as a wildlife habitat through the National Wildlife Federation by providing food, water, cover, and places to raise young, which is essentially just trees or shrubs for nesting. And that kind of supports them. And it's just kind of a general nice guide. And so basically think about creating your own wildlife sanctuary. Takes less water and maintenance than a traditional garden. And basically things need food, water, and shelter. And you can basically achieve that by planting a variety of native plants that flower, some that get berries that flower throughout the year, and provide a couple of bird baths or something like that for a source of water, and then at least some kind of dense shrubs for shelter. Birds will also stick around for nesting sites and nesting material. And you'll also attract lots of good insects that will help with garden pests that will always show up if you have a vegetable garden or a rose garden. These sorts of wildlife plantings will keep the good guys around that will eat up aphids and scale and things like that. You might have some, but it will help. One easy way to start is by considering something that I like to call a habitat hedge along the edge of your site. Most people have a long, whether a chain link fence, cinder block wall, just wood fence, and you could plant a variety of mid-sized shrubs into kind of a sequential hedge that provides a lot of biodiversity and a lot of habitat without a lot of space. And you don't need to have exclusively native plants to be friendly to wildlife, but as a default, that's a good place to start. And so things like elevated bird baths can be very simple. The way that I'm a fan of making bird baths is not to buy an expensive bird bath, but something like a glazed saucer that would go underneath a pot for like a plant and on top of a tree stump. It is perfect. If you're into it, by all means, you can get a normal bird bath. And we'll talk about, if you do bird baths, you need to keep them clean. We'll talk about all of those sorts of things in our upcoming wildlife habitat focused workshop, or a small recirculating little fountain in a pot is a nice kind of easy project. And it could be relatively modest. Here's a little solar fountain pump you can get for a few bucks online, keeping that water moving. And sometimes having a few rocks or something in it really helps if critters, especially insects, fall into the water, helps them get out. And you'll also want to leave a patch or two of bare soil, even if you mulch. If you decompose granite mulch, they can usually get into it. But our native bees and our native pollinators, they don't form hives like honeybees. They're usually solitary ground dwellers, so they need some space as well. If you're in most of our suburban neighborhoods and you have a few piles of rocks around and some native plants, you will get tons of lizards. My backyard is just filled with lizards all the time. And you go out on a warm day and they're doing push-ups both to cool themselves and as well to say that this is their territory, you are in their yard. It's just great to have around. They'll also help eat ants and some of the other things. Few logs or branches are good for either edging the mulch path as well, but they provide habitat for some other little critters. Again, if you're super worried about termites, you might skip this one, but I've never had an issue with termites. Oftentimes there'll be a little beneficial fungus will start breaking things down, and then there'll be some little beetles and stuff that will come, and then the birds will come to eat those. It kind of keeps the whole system going. So maybe narrow leaf milkweed for the butterflies. And one great way to start, if you don't have much going on in your parking strip. After things dry out in the summer, you'll have to clear it out. But I've seen all sorts of great little wildflower meadows and little parking strips where there's not too much else to do in terms of shrubs. Kind of a little natural look with maybe some stepping stones to get out of the car. And then thinking about water. And again, this is a whole other workshop. This is the sunken meadow that the different dry stream beds or swales lead to in my yard, final destination. It's also a nice place to spend a little time in a meadow. And so in terms of your design for water, the main thing is you're going to want to, when water comes, you want to do something to slow it down, spread it out, and let it sink in. And so we already looked at the broken concrete patio spaces, or kind of more broken up pathways that allow water to sink in right there. Gravel pathways are a great way to do that. So oftentimes, avoiding too much concrete on the narrow side of a house, making sure it's all permeable. Or even going as far as breaking up some of the concrete in the driveway so the car can still drive by, but plants and soil can grow. Here's one of my favorite examples of water coming down, replacing a downspout with a rain chain that lets water bounce down each one of these pieces of chain, slows it down, looks nice too, and then overflows into this gravel, which comes around the side of the yard. And this is called sometimes a French drain. It's kind of a mini dry stream bed, but because it's a narrow space, it's dug down deeper and then filled with a coarse gravel, usually about 1.5 inch size gravel, and then some accents of some other sizes. And that lets water kind of move subsurface through the holes in the gravel around to the side. Some will sink in, and the rest safely gets around the side of the house out to the front, where there can be a slightly wider area to let the water sink in. And this is a very informal, kind of very naturalistic style, but these same principles can work for any style of garden. So we're just going to quickly go through a few other slides, and then we'll wrap up with our example that kind of brings it all together. So another one, rain chain, which used to just be a downspout, going to a very simple little dry stream bed that lets water soak in all along it. Has some wider spaces, has some narrower spaces. Getting a little bit of a lag on the picture here. There we go. Mixture of native and Mediterranean plants. So got some lavenders in there, some Southwest sundrops. And even this garden that we looked at earlier, this is terraced. And so the water that falls is going to soak into each of those garden areas instead of just rolling down a slope out into the street. And then all the different materials are, if it's not garden soil, it's decomposed granite or gravel. So all that soaks in. Dry stream bed along the other side of the garden to take water from that downspout, let some of it soak in. But if there's too much, then it safely lets it go out to the street. So compare that to, this is kind of the natural grade of that neighborhood. That's the neighbor's yard, where any of the water they're falling just goes right out to the street, off into the storm drains and out into the ocean. Some areas are doing more and more at the municipal scale, the city scale, to capture some of that water that ends up in the storm drain, like we have going on out here at the Chino Basin Water Conservation District with our infiltration areas. And I just think that's a nice aesthetic note, a mix of the wilder kind of native look and then some very sculptural succulents. So one note before we get to the final example of pulling it all together. As you start to pull together your design, remember to plan for construction. Most important thing is just make sure you logically think it through at all. A lot of people get real excited about design. They start buying stuff and then they realize that they haven't really thought out how they're going to make it all happen. Are you going to do it all at once in phases or a bit of a time when you find the time? It's normally what I do. It's kind of build it out on the weekends as I have the time, different chunks. Plan to plant in the best season. That's mid to late fall. If you're thinking about your project now, you're not going to want to take it on until maybe a couple of weeks before Thanksgiving for the actual planting of it. Because even Waterwise plants need some time to adjust before our summer heat. Summer is the best time for contemplating design, killing turf. A lot of our hardest to kill grasses can only really be killed in the summer when they're actively growing or in the warm weather. So early fall, summer to early fall. And we talk about that at our Killing Your Turf the Right Way class coming up. also in our landscape transformation basics class. And then preparing irrigation as well. That can all be ready to go, all your site work, patios, all that sort of stuff, plant in the fall. Work with your budget and adjust your design and your phases as necessary. Maybe you can't take it all on at once. That's just fine. If you're going to work with a contractor, bring them in early. Make sure you understand what that's going to mean for budget, for phasing. Good contractors are really busy. It might take a while till you can get on their schedule. And if you have limits, especially in terms of budget, try to let that lead to creativity rather than just giving up on something. With contractors, ideally, always try to talk to 3, get bids. Don't just go with the cheapest guy with the truck. Having the right person to do the work, if you're hiring someone, makes all the difference. And so let's end with this example, kind of pull it all together. This is an example from the place that my partner and I used to rent in Altadena before we moved out. Bought my first home in Pomona, closer to where I work. And so I show a lot of examples from my current garden, but this is just a nice, simple example of using design for our old place. Moved in December 2016. Landlord said, do whatever you want in the backyard, just don't kill the fruit trees. So that's what we were going to do. And this is what it looked like when we moved in. Kind of some half-done landscape projects, abandoned raised bed that was in too much shade to grow any vegetables, and then all the weeds just kind of returned right away. She probably had someone gardener come in and just clean out the weeds to make it look nice when she was trying to get the place rented. There's some of our collection of random potted plants. And we're there for a little while, took a look at things, decided that we were going to get going on the design. So had a small picket fence. The last tenants had a dog, so that kept their dog in that part of the yard. That's what we were dealing with. So this is definitely an example. Doesn't need to cost a lot of money. We were renting. We weren't going to put in a ton of money, but wanted it to be nice. And there were some structures there we weren't going to tear down, some fruit trees we were going to keep. A really useful thing for starting to plan your site's design is either Google Maps, or better, you can download for free Google Earth Pro and zoom in and get a good aerial of your property. It's a little bit scary almost of how good of imagery you can get of any property, but you'll get something like that, which is very useful. So this was the backyard we're going to be looking at for the design. Relatively long backyard, total property size about 8,000 square feet. So definitely not small, but I mean, not crazy huge for a suburban lot. And so here's the system for design. And I see it's 11:59. Hopefully some of you can hold on till the end. If not, we have less than 10 minutes left. It's the first time that I've taught this exact workshop in this way. So maybe added a little too much content. So I appreciate you sticking with us for those of you who can. If you can't, it'll be posted on YouTube later so you can check it out. So here's the system that I like to use for the do-it-yourself design. We talked about your goals. Set your goals. Investigate your site. Take a good hard look at things with an eye towards design. You're going to look at what are the opportunities for your goals on the site, and then what are your constraints? What are the things that are going to be issues that you have to deal with? You're then going to create a list of physical features that you want to have there, and also kind of the activities that are going to happen there. So you can start to think where your people space is going to be. How are the plant spaces going to be in between? What are those people spaces that you want or need? Then with that, you're going to research, how do I set up a bird bath? If I'm going to take on doing a broken concrete patio myself, because I'm young and have a good back, how do I do that? Plenty of great information online about all that sort of stuff, if it's kind of one of the very specific things we don't have a workshop about. Organize your features that you're going to have in your landscape, and think a lot in terms of priority and permanence, meaning it's much more important to think about where you're going to plant your oak tree and where you're going to put your patio space that you're going to invest a lot of time, effort, and money in than it is where you're going to put your bird bath, which you can easily move. Roughly draw out and diagram their locations, which we're going to do together in just a second, show an example of that. Refine it all, if you are so inclined, by putting it all to scale on graph paper, drawing it out. I'm going to provide you with that resource in a moment, working from your largest, most permanent features to your small ones. This is recommended, but it's definitely not absolutely necessary. If you're not that type of person, doesn't mean you can't do design. Choose and place your plants then in those spaces for your plants using Inland Valley Garden Planner or other resources and research. Then you do it, But design is a continual process, we've already said. So then, especially with the plant part, as things grow, you can evaluate, reassess, tweak, repeat, make it a fun and learning experience. So let's design it. So I always start with just a very rough drawing. So normally what I do is I'll put it up on a computer screen using that Google Earth Pro or Google Maps program, zoom in, and then just draw it out on blank paper. And it doesn't need to be a work of art, shouldn't even be, it's not worth the effort. And oftentimes I'll just start wrong, throw out the piece of paper, maybe the third time I'll get it. After that, save that piece of paper and work with tracing paper over that. Or if you're doing it digitally, do a save as and go. You always want to be able to go back to the base without having to redraw the base each time. Then I list my goals. And so if it wasn't for this presentation, maybe it'd be a piece of paper nearby, but I keep that piece of paper nearby because it's easy to lose sight of it as you're thinking about all these things that you want to put in. Keep focused on your goals. So for this example, the goals were habitat, a nice place to be. We want to grow some food. We want to hold all the water that fell on the property, a place to eat outside, a place to read outside, a place to cook outside. And then with habitat, really want to support birds and insects and lizards, a place to have our compost pile. And we also had just a really noisy neighborhood. Had very nice neighbors, but it just so happened that across from us within one block, there were 3 different landscaping companies based out of houses there. And so the whole crews would meet in the morning. There'd be a lot of equipment, either tuning or even like people would wash their cars and use the leaf blowers to dry them off, just a lot of noise. So we want to dampen that noise. And so this is kind of the layout of the house. Mostly we had a lot of fruit trees. So it was mostly part shade in the front, some shade as well with crepe myrtle tree and 2 big palm trees. So that was going to be one of our challenges. We had a couple of shade structures in decent enough shape that we could leave them. And then this existing network of pathway made out of broken concrete already. So then we went into our site analysis. So site analysis is just a fancy word for noting your observations, but it's useful to have your drawing first because then you can, on a layer of tracing paper, really physically draw out all the things that you notice that are going to have an impact on your design. And then following that, you have another layer that you can put on top of it where you start drawing out your design with an eye towards the actual locations of your observations. So observe for as long as it's going to take you. A full year is not too much if you're new to the property before you really start investing and making big changes, especially a winter, to understand where water goes when it rains, because sometimes it's surprising. It's kind of hard to totally anticipate, even if you do this quite a bit, how much water is going to accumulate in which places. You're going to really want to note which areas are sunny, which areas are shady, which areas are part shade, which areas are going to be shady a lot of the year, then full blasting sun in summer, like the north side of a house or a garage. And in that downloadable that I mentioned, Native Garden Design Guide, that's at that cbwcd.org/presentations. There's a little box that talks about kind of the different directions, north, south, east, west facing, and what that might mean for your design. You're going to want to look at your soil and drainage. Same publication has how to do a drainage test. Ideally 2 to 3 inches per hour for well-drained plants. Plenty of ways to go if it's not. Think about views, both onto the property, like from your neighbors. Do they have a 2nd-story addition that's going to look down into your backyard that you want some more privacy? Put something tall there, big plant. Or are there views that you want to keep? Like my front yard has a nice view of the mountains because unfortunately there's not a lot of street trees in my neighborhood, but that keeps a view opened up. So I'm going to put trees in my front yard, but I'm going to make sure I space them so I can keep that mountain view. Water flows, good to document at least one good rain event just to see where water's going before you do your design. Microclimates, those are your particularly hot, often, or particularly cold areas. So areas that get a lot of reflected heat, maybe along an asphalt driveway, west side of a house, something like that. And occasionally I've worked with some people in Southern California that have frost pockets in their yard that might need plants that can take a little bit more cold hardiness, where our normal plants are relatively well adapted, but some of them have problems with too much frost. Noise and other neighbor issues. Do you need to do something like a water feature to quiet things down? Views, I guess I have it twice because it's that important. Existing plants you want to keep. If you have a medium water use tree, that you want to keep because it's a nice tree, that's great. Make sure that the plants you group with that are going to be plants that want or tolerate medium water use, because you're going to need to keep providing it to that tree. And if there's any places that you naturally use and that you naturally don't, those might be things, kind of figure out why. Is it super hot? Is the neighbor's air conditioning system makes a lot of noise in that part of your yard? Something like that. And so here is our site analysis, where I'll often use blue areas for where the water goes. It's at a long detached driveway that actually flooded the garage because it didn't have a way to go out. A little bit of it got that way, but we'd have to deal with that in the design as part of it. And then other than that, the water came off both sides of the house, and mostly not rain gutters, just one small area. But the slope was gentle enough that we had a feeling that just a mulched garden would be able to accommodate a lot of that water. Just had to deal with it there. Our deep shade on our north exposures were here and here, but most of the yard was part shade. We knew we wanted to do some vegetables, so sun analysis was really important. That's a morning sun here, okay sun here. Best sun happened to be in an inconvenient spot over a concrete driveway. It is what it is. And so that was going to be really important. And most of the rest we had part shade. A lot of noise from this side. And this is the time to be very honest. There was just weird vibes from this neighbor over here. And right here was just a chain link fence. So sometimes she'd just be out, just kind of standing, not really doing much in her driveway. Wasn't causing a problem for us. But right here was where we would want to just kind of sit and hang out, maybe in the early evening on a nice day. And it kind of felt like she was right there in the yard with us sometimes. So we'd want to build up some more. These trees were kind of tall, so you could see through. Want to build up some more buffer right there. So those are the sorts of things that getting this analysis right down onto the paper, we're going to really be able to help with. And from there, you can start to figure out where your different goals are going to be met with your different elements. And I'm just going to zoom into the backyard because it's a little bit much to look at it all at once. And so we realized, first thing, we wanted to grow food, and that was going to be the toughest because of our not that much sun. And so we realized we needed to use our full sun areas to grow our veggies. And we were just going to build vegetable beds, raised beds right on that concrete driveway because we had plenty of space to park our cars. We just made that decision. And then the other okay sun area back here, we're going to have to use that for vegetables. Our native plants, well, we wanted to do a lot of habitat. We had mostly part shade. So a lot of times people think of the native habitat plants, they naturally think more of full sun, but we knew that we were just going to have to deal some part shade. We had these fruit trees, so it's going to be higher water. So we came up with this concept of having an orchard meadow, where we'd plant a native meadow of plants that can take the same amount of water as the fruit trees, did some more research as well, to grow underneath these fruit trees. And then we had these awkward kind of full sun areas, just little areas here and there that wouldn't be good for like a vegetable bed. They were these kind of strange, relatively small shapes. And those would be our spots of full sun habitat native plants. Our compost, that was great. A shady spot is perfect for compost, and then back around the side of the yard. And then our habitat hedge, mentioned that idea before, that would be great along this whole wall, both sides, provide us some more privacy, have that habitat value. And then our water feature for the noise we put here. So we would get that both in our shade area that we decided would be the main area for reading, the main area for eating, and then also looking at proximity, our vegetable beds, our grill, and then our shade area for eating, all kind of nice and close to the main house. Our bird bath was here because it gave us a nice view from inside, all the way inside the house, we realized, and then the sunroom where our cats would like to sit and look out at the birds. And that's how it all comes together in a nutshell after all of that talk. Thinking through all of those things to think about the locations, and then going back to that whole kind of almost menu that we talked about of materials and styles and all that sort of stuff. If you do want to take the next step to draw it all out on graph paper, there's a great free downloadable resource called Lawn Be Gone, provided for free by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. You can download it. I set up just a quick link, cbwcd.org/G3book. And depending on your browser, it might take a while to load the whole thing, and then you could save it, or it might just download the PDF automatically. And it goes through how to start with drawing up your site plan based on measurements, how to draw out and do a little bit more of that on paper analysis about rainfall, how to then do your scaled planting plan, and it has some other good ideas to think about. And so just to kind of see how that all turned out for our yard with design plus the work, and just a year, we went from that to realigning the broken concrete patio to connect all, or broken concrete walkway to connect areas, and then young full sun little perennials and native and waterwise plants coming in along the path. We like a pretty naturalistic look, a pretty informal for our home landscape. So that's just kind of what we embraced. Some native wildflowers, some spilling out onto the path are just fine. Here's our orchard meadow growing in, just starting to, not a whole lot of color yet, but some contrast in the shapes of the plants that like that part shade. The back of that yard had an old galvanized water trough that someone tried to fill with soil and used to grow veggies, didn't realize that they needed to put a hole in the bottom for drainage, but that worked out well for us. We just dug it out, put a $25 fountain pump in there, and put in some native water plants. And you can see the native meadow grasses starting to grow in on the next slide. Setting up just with some inexpensive outdoor furniture, are a nice place to sit, relax, and read, surrounded by the plants. Building where we decided to design in our bird bath, just an inexpensive bird bath with a ceramic saucer and a rock in it. Birds moved in right away. And then just kind of putting a whole system like this in motion, you start to notice other little things like this wreath that my partner had made out of grapevines and little spider webs. And then we'd see hummingbirds coming along and harvesting the spider webs because that's what they use to hold their nests together. So providing a space for all that to happen and for us to observe it. So here's at 1 year, some mixture of annual wildflowers that we tossed out just from a seed packet and perennials coming in. We'd also leave other various bits of things out for the birds to see what they would take for their nests. And even the vegetable beds built on the concrete started to look quite lovely, intermixed with the view of the wildflowers in front of them. Our habitat hedge close up started to have some nice details from the California coffee berry. Our ornamental pomegranate, which also produced great fruit, but very lovely. And you can see we just decided to right thing in the right place. There was a orange tree with a little bit more tree canopy. Use that to provide part shade for our little nursery area of plants that we had on the left. And again, you can have it all. It doesn't need to be wall-to-wall water-wise. We like to grow veggies. So our veggie bed here on a drip irrigation system, that because it just watered this area, we can have dry areas around it that we just hose water every once in a while with some native perennials. And then our fruit tree is on a separate irrigation system. Planted some edible Opuntia cactus that will provide nopales and eventually kind of screen off the compost area a little bit as well. Some growing to do. And so this is at 2 years, getting to the very end, where you can see our raised vegetable beds, very productive on the sunniest spot that we had, which was right on top of the concrete. That's why we built them extra high, to make sure they have some drainage. And some more of our native plants starting to grow in. Some collection of potted native succulents. And then starting to use also our eating area, we realized it had the right sun qualities to be our little nursery as we started seeds for our next season of vegetable gardens. And I mentioned that, our approach was build it a little bit as we had time. So there was always, this is the very side yard, one of the last things we took on, was clearing out some overgrown vines and then starting to plant. You can barely see them, so it's part of that habitat hedge to let it get going. So it doesn't need to be done and perfect all at once if you're doing it yourself. Don't put that pressure on you. See some other views of the water feature. And I keep it simple. I just let the extension cord go out the back. And by the time the plants grow in, no one really notices it. So here's our meadow growing in as well. Nice of lots of calm greens. And then our habitat hedge, again, don't expect instant everything to grow in. It's better for the plants and way better for your budget to plant as small as possible. And some things will get going quicker and some things will take a little bit more time. And that's just the nature of working with the living system. But all of this is directly responding to the design. It's not random. If we took it on randomly, we'd end up with our vegetables in too much shade, a less cohesive look to the landscape, and probably with the amount of shade we had, trying to put some of our favorite plants in too much shade. So in this property, we didn't have enough room to put all of our favorite full sun plants in, but that's just fine. We're still able to have a lovely garden. Here's some of our flowering meadow plants coming out. And here, this was just a rental. So I'm not showing this to you to show you the most beautiful garden you've ever seen. We were just going to stick with the bits of broken concrete we had and have some nice plants. But it was a great, great landscape that, especially when we first moved before our new garden started to grow in, we really, really missed. Did everything that we wanted it to do. Eventually planted a couple more fruit trees. And then just to kind of conclude, because we were big on growing our veggies as well, so we'd be able to harvest our vegetables from that garden and grill them up a few steps away, and then take just a few more steps and eat it at our outdoor eating area, surrounded by our lovely garden as the birds and the butterflies came through for the habitat plants, or on the morning, sit in these old wooden chairs that we had, but we put them in the right place to sit down, enjoy a cup of coffee, and really enjoy it all. And my partner is also amazing at using certain native plants to make really innovative cocktails, which came from our garden as well. And so also just to kind of be honest, no garden looks, incredible every day of the year. So once you get into August, everything will look just a little bit tired. But if you have a shade canopy like we did, some plants providing shade, some trees, it's still going to be a very comfortable space to be in. And this was, and it was still productive with vegetables. But remember, it's more fun if you never consider your garden truly done. So that is basically it for the design class. Thank you for sitting through it with me. I hope you learned some valuable information. So what's next is start thinking about design, but remember to plant at the best time of year, which is mid-November or a little bit later. Spend the summer planning, learning, joining us for more workshops, designing, killing your turf, and early fall doing other site work and irrigation. If you're doing a lot of work, if you're putting in patio elements and things like that, maybe be working on that in the summer. And with that, I'm going to both launch the ending poll. So please let us know your feedback from this class. This is really important information for us. We love other comments. If there's anything that was particularly useful to you, anything you want to let us know that was not part of the poll, please let us know in the chat. We love reading all of them, and also anything that could have worked better for you. We're always changing our workshop, so this is the first time that I taught this in this exact way. Definitely let us know. We really value all of that sort of feedback. And with that, I will say thank you very much for joining us. Hope you join us again. Remember to sign up for our newsletter. And here are just a few of our upcoming workshop topics that we will be presenting at our online workshops. And with that, we do have a couple of questions left. So why don't we get to those as well? Oh, just one question left. So I will read that out. I have a wattle tree that was planted too close to my house, and I'm forced to get rid of the tree. Well, that might be a conversation to have with an arborist. You have two questions, or two options. You can prune it, or you could possibly remove it. Depends on what species. Wattle refers to acacia. Some acacias are not huge trees, and they don't get huge trunks, and some of them only live for 20 years or so. So you're going to want to understand what tree it is and how big it's going to get. Some of them are really more like shrubs that are kind of trees, and that, if it's planted a foot away from your house, I would just go ahead and remove it. If it's planted 5 feet away from your house or even 4 feet and it's one of the smaller ones, that might be just fine. And if anyone has other questions, feel free to type them in now, and we should have some time to get to them. KN, you are still with us, and you had a lot of questions about water harvesting and grades. So I will try to get to some of those now. I would also very much recommend that you join us for our water harvesting class that we are going to have this winter. I think that will help you out a lot. So I'll just kind of read the questions that I'm seeing within this and get to them. One of the questions is, what's the difference in water capture between a swale and a bioswale? The language can get kind of confusing. And is one hold water and one moves water? Just kind of what's going on with that. So the formal definitions of things are kind of confusing, and then the way people use them are even more confusing. From a classical engineering term, a swale has a slope on the bottom and moves water from one space to another. From the horticultural way it's used, the way that people actually use it in gardens and not civil engineering, a swale can either have a slope on the bottom or it can be flat on the bottom and used more to infiltrate water, to hold on to water and infiltrate it. So flat on the bottom, if you want to have it kind of soak in evenly, is going to be the way to go, or as close to flat as possible. Realistically, in terms of how it's used, talking about landscapes, it can be either. It just depends on what you want to use it for. As flat as possible on the bottom, but sometimes it needs to slope some, and then you can just make it be a little bit deeper in certain areas to hold water, and then making sure you have a nice gentle slope to move water are both options. A swale is only different than a bioswale. Bioswale is a specific kind of swale that has a biological component. And what that actually means in practice is it has plants either next to it or also plants in the bottom of it. A swale is essentially like a trench, a wide, gentle trench. So like even a dry stream bed is a specific kind of swale that's made to look like a dry stream bed, usually with cobblestone or something like that. The bio part comes from the roots of plants, which can be in it, as in like different grasses, usually some other plants like yarrow that can take periodic flooding and are just fine with that. And then the water goes down, and then they can take not needing to be in kind of an aquatic situation all the time, or even plants planted to the side of it that roots will be underneath that area. And the bio part is basically that because the roots are there, there is a more biologically active zone of soil where there's also bacteria and fungus living in relationship with those plants, because the plants exude sugars that some of the other soil microorganisms can't make for themselves. The plant makes it with photosynthesis. And in that interaction, those, especially the bacteria, are able to capture certain pollutants as they quickly move and kind of infiltrate down through the soil, so that it provides an additional level of cleansing and purification as it goes through. Now, realistically, depending on where you live, most of our landscapes aren't going to have super dirty soil washing through it. And just natural soil has an ability, as long as there's plants growing somewhere in it, has an ability to clean soil pretty well, even without the plant component sometimes. So if it's just water that's raining and washing over your garden, it's going to be pretty clean anyways, usually. But if you're getting water that's coming off the street, off of a driveway where there might be oil or brake dust, or even at the first flush of just the air pollution that settled on your roof after a whole dry season, that can definitely help. But, you know, technically a dry stream bed with plants planted to the side of it, whose roots are going to be going underneath it, that's a bioswale. And then, yeah, whether it's flat or curved, that's just up to you. You mentioned that you're on a relatively flat site. So just make sure that you're going to have enough water coming into your system and kind of size things correctly. So if you're capturing water like off of your roof, there are resources out there to kind of do those calculations to kind of help figure it out. And One just kind of book that goes into that a lot is Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands. It's written for Arizona by a guy named Brad Lancaster, but other than the plant references and how much water things need, the principles hold true for here. There's 2 volumes. They're both really good. You can buy them online. Some of them go into more large scale properties if kind of you're out in the country more, but a lot of the stuff is really relevant. And he has a great website as well. I think it's just rainwaterharvesting.com, but if you Google Rainwater Harvesting Brad Lancaster, you'll find it. So yeah, hopefully that helps. And if you have other specific questions, feel free to type them in. We can answer George's question now. You want to read that one, Brandon?
Yeah, George's question is, what's your preferred treatment to rid weeds after mulching?
Preferred treatment to rid weeds after mulching. So after the mulch is already down, my preferred treatment is to pull them out by hand. Takes time, but that's generally what I like to do. If the mulch is light, some hose and other tools can work, but once you have the mulch down, handwork is often the easiest. There is a tool, a hand tool called a hori hori. It's kind of a Japanese garden knife, was originally used for bonsai, but it's just a little bit more effective than a trowel. It's really good for sticking to the soil and helping pop out weeds. Makes hand weeding a lot more effective. So I usually have that with me, and a bucket or something like that. I generally really try to stay away from herbicides and sprays, both for ecological reasons and as well as once you have an existing garden, it's really easy to spray your plants by accident that you want to hold on to.
Awesome. And then we had one more just come in. So this question is, I know that drought tolerant landscape that is comprised of natives and fruit trees at the LA Arboretum that Lee Adams designed does not need any additional watering beyond normal rainfall. What are the main design features that make this possible?
That is a good question. I have known Lee Adams for many years. I am going to get in touch with her after that. I was not aware that there was 0 additional irrigation throughout the entire summer, I would say, and that fruit trees are producing well. So like a pomegranate is a very well adapted tree and can get through a summer after it's established, oftentimes without any additional watering, but won't produce fruit reliably. So that's the first I've heard that. I'd love to know if you are absolutely 100% sure that that's true. And I'm definitely going to get in touch with Lee and ask her about that. But the main things are water capture and lots of organic matter built up over time with mulching and composting.
And then one that we had that I accidentally hit that we answered it was there any plants that would repel mosquitoes?
I don't know. Lots of those things. I mean, I've heard that for a lot of pest insects, including mosquitoes, sometimes like heavily scented things like sages or things like that will kind of throw them off. I don't think it's true. I don't know. If there's mosquitoes around and I'm outside, I'm one of those people that they like and they will bite me. Yeah, I think a lot of those things are maybe they kind of sort of work, but I would stick with the more natural eucalyptus oil-based mosquito repellent sprays. If you find something out that actually does work and you try it and it's true, it's not something you've read on the internet, please get in touch and let me know. I would love to know.
I mean, me personally, I live in a relatively sterile rental house, and there's a lot of birds around. So the birds love to eat the mosquitoes. So building bird habitat might be a helpful solution.
Yeah, that could definitely help. Bats as well. If you live in a big enough space where you can put up some bat boxes, bats love to eat mosquitoes. Could be something, although, that would probably require large property suburbs, if not living out in the country. Yeah, good point, Brandon. I can tell Helen wrote in that marigolds she heard repel mosquitoes. I've gotten bit in mosquitoes with gardens with marigolds. So yeah, I don't know. It also just might depend on how many you have in the area. The biggest thing to do is just make sure that you don't have any standing water on your property. Check your roof gutters. Some of the new species of mosquitoes that we have only had around in Southern California for a few years are more active during the daytime and only need as much water as like the plastic cap to a water bottle. If something like that is filled with water in your yard in the summer, that's enough for them to breed in. So really habitat control is going to be your best thing. But if your neighbor has a lot of habitat, they're going to be around. Okay,
I think that's all.
That gets us through the questions. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. And yeah, very soon we will have the slides from this presentation up at cbwc.org/presentations, and we'll have the recording of it up on our YouTube page. So hope you join us for one of our upcoming workshops. And thanks for spending your Saturday morning with us, and have a good rest of your weekend.